Good evening and welcome back tonight. We're stepping into the world of the library that burned at the edge of memory. Dinosaurs of Jurassic World. There is a world that existed before longing, before any creature turned its face toward the sky and felt the pull of something unnamed stirring behind its eyes. Before wonder had a shape, before beauty had a witness, before the first syllable of the first prayer was murmured into the first dark night, by the first being who ever felt small beneath the stars. There was a world, immense, unhurried, and so deeply saturated with green that the horizon itself seemed to breathe. Not with wind alone, not with the mechanical rhythm of atmosphere and pressure and the cold equations that govern the movement of air across the surface of a spinning planet, but with the slow, deliberate, ancient pulse of a living Earth. A planet so thoroughly, so extravagantly alive, that every surface, every stone, every crevice, every particle of soil was claimed by something growing, something reaching, something unfurling in the warm and heavy air, as though the earth were composing a letter to the future. And every fern, every frond, every spiral of green was a word in a language too old, too vast, too patient for any mind to read. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of the present fall from you like a garment you no longer need. Let the noise of this century dissolve. The hum of electricity, the murmur of machines, the constant whisper of a world that has forgotten how to be silent. Let all of it fade. Let it thin and scatter like morning mist touched by the first warmth of the sun. And in its place, let the centuries return. Not hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds of millions. A span of time so vast, so incomprehensibly deep, that the mind cannot contain it, only stand at its edge and feel the vertigo of looking down into a well that has no bottom. A darkness that is not empty, but full, heavy, with the accumulated weight of everything that has ever lived and breathed and moved across the surface of this ancient, patient, dreaming earth. What lies below is not a memory. There was no one yet to remember. No consciousness to record. No language to preserve. No hand to press meaning into clay or carve significance into stone. It is something older than memory. Something more fundamental. Something closer to a dream. The kind of dream that comes in the deepest hours of sleep, when the body has fully surrendered to the dark and the mind moves through landscapes that feel more real than waking, more true than anything the daylight has ever shown you. A dream the earth dreamed of itself, in the long and silent hours before it knew that dreaming was possible. It is said that the Jurassic period began approximately 201 million years ago, that it lasted for nearly 56 million years, that it ended approximately 145 million years before the present moment, before this breath, before this night, before this gentle drifting towards sleep that carries you now like a leaf on a slow and ancient river. But these numbers, these measurements, these careful calculations of isotope decay and stratigraphic position are merely the scaffolding, the wooden frame upon which a cathedral of living experience was built. They tell us when, they tell us how long, but they tell us nothing, nothing at all, of what it felt like, of the warmth, of the moisture, of the way the air pressed against the skin of creatures who had no name for comfort, but who lived within it as naturally, as completely, as a stone lives within the river that shapes it. To speak of the Jurassic in numbers is to describe a symphony by counting the notes. It is to speak of the ocean by measuring the salt. The music itself, the sacred, breathing, trembling music of that ancient world, cannot be captured in data. It can only be felt, approached on tiptoe, entered the way one enters a dark and ancient forest, slowly with reverence, with the willingness to be changed by what one finds within. And tonight, in this quiet hour, in this space between waking and sleep, we will try to feel it. Not all of it, not even a fraction, but enough. A breath, a heartbeat, a single footstep pressed into the mud of a world that existed before the concept of time had any meaning at all. Imagine a clearing, Not a clearing made by human hands. Not a space carved from the body of a forest by the sharp edge of iron or the determined swing of an axe. Not a field ploughed and planted and fenced with the geometry of human intention. But a clearing made by the passage of giants. A place where the undergrowth has been pressed flat by the weight of bodies so immense, so fundamentally beyond the scale of anything the modern world contains, that the forest itself learned to make room for them. Learned, over generations of growth and regrowth, to yield, to open, to create, in the heart of its own densest reaches, spaces wide enough and bare enough for the great ones to pass through without destruction. Corridors of compressed fern and flattened cycad that would spring back slowly over days and weeks, only to be pressed flat again by the next passage of the next enormous, unhurried, eternal procession. The ferns have been folded down against the soil. Their fronds, those delicate, fractal masterpieces of natural geometry, lie crushed into dark, wet patterns against the earth, still glistening with the moisture that pervades everything in this world. Some fronds are broken, some are merely bent, their tips curling upward already beginning the slow work of recovery, of return, of reaching once more toward the green light that filters down through the canopy like water through a sieve. The cycads at the clearing's edges lean slightly inward, as if bowing, their stiff palm-like crowns tilted at angles that suggest not damage but deference, as if the plants themselves recognize the passage of something worthy of acknowledgement. And on the ground, in the soft, dark, moisture-rich soil of the clearing's center, there are marks, not scratches, not the shallow impressions of small creatures passing quickly, but deep, round depressions pressed into the earth with a weight and a patience that beggar description. Each one is perhaps 3 feet across, each one is several inches deep, each one is filled, or beginning to fill, with the thin, clear water that seeps constantly upward through the saturated soil of this warm and dripping world. And in each tiny pool of collected water, the green of the canopy above is reflected. A miniature sky held in a basin of earth, created by the pressure of a single footstep from a creature whose body was longer than the clearing is wide. The mist hangs between the trunks of the trees, not moving, not drifting, not responding to any current of air or disturbance of temperature. It simply hangs, suspended still, as if the atmosphere itself has decided to pause, to hold its breath, to wait for something that it knows is coming but cannot name. The mist is white, but not the white of snow or paper or blank absence. It is the white of diffusion, of light that has passed through so many particles of moisture, so many droplets of suspended water, that it has lost all direction and become omnipresent. The mist does not illuminate, it saturates. It does not reveal, it softens. Everything seen through it acquires a quality of dream, of memory, of something that exists not quite in the present, but in some adjacent space where time moves differently, or does not move at all. The trees that frame the clearing are Araucaria, ancient conifers whose lineage stretches back further than the Jurassic itself, back into the Triassic and perhaps beyond, into the deep and murky reaches of the Paleozoic, where the first forests were still learning how to be forests. Their trunks are massive, 3, 4, 5 feet in diameter, and their bark is extraordinary, deeply furrowed, patterned in overlapping scales and ridges that give each trunk the appearance of a column, carved by a mason of infinite patience and questionable sanity. The bark is dark, a deep warm brown that verges on black in the shadows, and it is rough to the touch in a way that modern tree bark rarely achieves. It is armor, it is texture, it is the accumulated record of decades of growth, written in wood and resin and the slow expansion of living tissue against the constraints of its own history. The canopy is far above, perhaps 100 feet, perhaps more. It is difficult to judge distance in a world where the mist softens every edge and the light has no hard source, No single origin, no shadow casting directionality. The canopy is simply there, a ceiling of interlocking branches and dark green needles that closes over the forest, like a lid, like a dome, like the vault of a cathedral that has no walls, only pillars, each one a living trunk rising from the soil, with the quiet confidence of something that has been growing for centuries and intends to continue for centuries more. Through the spaces in this canopy, light descends. Not sunlight, not directly. The sun is up there somewhere, blazing away with the same nuclear fury it has maintained for billions of years and will maintain for billions more. But its light has been filtered, transformed, translated by its passage through the green veil above. What reaches the forest floor is not golden and not white. It is green, a deep, luminous, living green, the color of sunlight that has passed through so many layers of chlorophyll-rich tissue, so many overlapping fronds and needles and leaves, that it has been fundamentally altered. Baptized, one might say. Made sacred by its passage through the living veil. And this green light fills the clearing, fills the spaces between the trunks, fills the hollows of the footprints, fills the mist itself, so that everything exists in a kind of perpetual emerald twilight. A world without harsh shadows, without bright highlights, without the dramatic contrasts that the modern eye takes for granted. A world submerged in green, the way the ocean floor is submerged in blue. Completely, utterly, with no escape and no desire to escape. And through that green, through that mist, through that stillness that feels more solid than stone, something stirs. You do not see it first. You feel it. A vibration. Low, deep. So far below the threshold of hearing that it registers not in the ears but in the body, in the chest, in the bones, in the soles of the feet pressed against the forest floor. A rhythmic tremor, patient and unhurried, like the heartbeat of the world itself made manifest in motion. It comes in pulses. Not quick, not anxious, not driven by urgency or fear. Slow, measured, deliberate. Each pulse separated from the next by several seconds. Each one slightly stronger than the last. The vibration is approaching, growing closer. And as it grows closer, other signs appear. The water in the footprint pools begins to tremble, tiny concentric ripples spreading from the center of each depression outward, reaching the muddy edges and vanishing, only to be renewed by the next pulse. A fern frond that had been perfectly still begins to nod. A gentle, rhythmic dipping, as if keeping time with some deep and inaudible music. A drop of condensation, hanging from a moss-covered branch overhead, releases its grip and falls, catching the green light as it descends, striking the surface of a footprint pool with a tiny crystalline sound that is immediately swallowed by the larger silence. And then, at the edge of the clearing, where the mist is thickest, where the green light dims into deeper shadow, something moves. Not suddenly. Not with the explosive burst of a predator launching from concealment. Not with any urgency at all, but with the slow, inevitable, unstoppable momentum of a glacier descending a valley, of a tide rising up a beach, of the earth itself turning on its axis. The ferns at the clearing's edge begin to sway. Not from wind. There is no wind here. There has been no wind for hours, perhaps days, in this sheltered, saturated, still interior. But from the sheer displacement of air around a body so vast that its movement reshapes the atmosphere through which it passes. And then, through the mist, a shape begins to emerge. Not all at once. Not with the sudden appearance of something arriving, but with the no revelation of something that has always been there. Something the mist has been holding, protecting, concealing until this exact moment. The way the earth conceals its most sacred things beneath layers of stone and silence and time, revealing them only to those who approach with the right combination of patience and reverence and willingness to be overwhelmed. First, a leg, a single columnar foreleg, wider than the trunk of any tree in the clearing, darker than the mist through which it descends. It moves forward with a ponderous grace that contradicts its mass. Not clumsy, not lumbering, but smooth, controlled, powered by muscles and tendons of extraordinary refinement. The foot that meets the ground is broad and round, padded with a cushion of tough, resilient tissue that spreads under the creature's weight, distributing the force of contact across a surface area wide enough to prevent the foot from sinking more than a few inches into the saturated soil. The footfall is not loud, it is deep, a bass note felt rather than heard, a compression of the earth that sends its tremor outward in all directions, through the soil, through the roots, through the network of underground connections that link every plant in the forest to every other in a web of mycorrhizal threads so vast and so ancient that it functions as a kind of nervous system, the Earth's own way of feeling itself. Then the body, emerging from the mist like a landmass rising from the sea, vast, curved, the barrel of a torso so large that it blocks the green light and creates, for a moment, a shadow that encompasses the entire clearing. The skin is textured, not smooth, not scaled in the way one might imagine, but covered in a surface of small, irregular bumps and creases, like the skin of an elephant, magnified and extended across a surface area that is simply beyond easy comprehension. The color is muted, dark grey-green perhaps, with patches of lighter tone along the flanks, the precise pattern obscured by the moisture and the mist and the green light that softens everything into dream. And then the neck, rising from the front of that enormous body, like the trunk of a tree growing sideways, like the arm of a crane extending over a construction site, like nothing the modern world contains except in the metaphors we reach for when confronted with something that resists description. The neck extends forward and slightly upward, curving gently, each vertebra articulating with the next in a flexible chain that allows the whole structure to sway, slowly, gently, with a rhythm that matches the creature's walking pace, sweeping through the air with a grace that seems impossible for something of this size. At the end of the neck, almost lost in the mist ahead, a small head. Surprisingly small, disproportionately small, a head no larger than that of a horse, mounted at the end of a neck that is longer than the tallest tree in many modern forests. The head turns, the eyes, dark, calm, ancient, survey the clearing with an attention that is not intelligence exactly, but something deeper, something more fundamental. An awareness that has been refined by 100 million years of evolutionary pressure into exactly what it needs to be. No more, no less. A consciousness perfectly fitted to the world it inhabits, the way a river is perfectly fitted to the valley it has carved. The creature moves through the clearing without pause. It does not stop. It does not look down at the footprints it leaves. It does not acknowledge the ferns that bow in its wake. It simply continues, forward, through the mist, through the green light, through the ancient forest that parts before it and closes behind it, like water around the hull of a ship, moving with the patience and the purpose of something that has been walking this path for longer than any single lifetime could contain, following a route inscribed not in memory, but in instinct, in the ancient, wordless knowledge that the body carries in its bones. And then it is gone, swallowed by the mist, returned to the green from which it emerged. And the clearing is still again, still but changed. The footprints are fresh now. The water has not yet had time to seep into them. The ferns are still pressed flat. The air still holds the faintest trace of warmth from the creature's passage. A warmth that will dissipate within minutes, that will be absorbed by the moisture and the mist and the patient, breathing, all-encompassing green. This is the Jurassic. This is the Garden of Giants. And we are here now standing in the clearing, listening to the fading vibration of footsteps that grow softer, not because the creature has stopped, but because the earth absorbs them, the way the earth absorbs all things in time. The way it will absorb these footprints, this clearing, this entire forest, this entire world, pressing it down, compressing it, transforming it, over millions of years, into the stone from which, one distant day, we will extract the faintest traces of what was once a living, breathing, walking, dreaming, impossibly magnificent reality. To understand the garden, we must first understand the garden's soil. Not merely the physical soil, though that too was extraordinary, rich and dark and teeming with microbial life in quantities that would stagger a modern biologist. But the deeper soil, the context, the conditions that made this particular world possible, that allowed creatures of this particular size and this particular nature to exist, to thrive, to dominate every continent on the planet for a span of time that dwarfs every human civilization combined by a factor of thousands. It is said that the Jurassic world was warm. This is true, but the word warm does not do justice to the reality. The Jurassic was not warm the way a summer afternoon is warm, not warm the way a heated room is warm. It was warm the way a greenhouse is warm. A pervasive, inescapable, all-encompassing warmth that had no edges, no boundaries, no places of relief. There were no polar ice caps. The temperature difference between the equator and the poles was far less dramatic than it is today. Perhaps half as great, perhaps even less. The entire planet was wrapped in a blanket of thermal energy that penetrated everywhere, that softened every climate, that turned even the highest latitudes into habitable, vegetated living landscapes. This warmth was driven in part by the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels during the Jurassic were significantly higher than they are today, perhaps 4 to 7 times higher by some estimates. This created a greenhouse effect of extraordinary potency, trapping solar energy within the atmosphere and radiating it back to the surface, maintaining global temperatures that were, on average, perhaps 5 to 10 degrees Celsius warmer than the present. 5 to 10 degrees does not sound like much, but in the language of climate, it is enormous. It is the difference between ice and water, between desert and forest, between a world that supports creatures of extraordinary size and a world that constrains them. The warmth brought moisture. The warmer the air, the more water it can hold. This is a simple truth of atmospheric physics. But in the Jurassic, its consequences were profound. The air was thick with humidity. Water vapor pervaded everything, visible sometimes as mist, sometimes as fog, sometimes as the faint luminous haze that hung between the trunks of trees and softened every distance into a dreaming blur. Rainfall was abundant, far more abundant in many regions than anything the modern world experiences. Rivers were wider and slower. Lakes were more numerous. Shallow inland seas crept across the continents, creating coastlines of extraordinary complexity. Lagoons and estuaries and tidal flats, where the boundary between land and water shifted with the seasons and the tides and the slow, long-term fluctuations of sea level that accompanied the continued breakup of the great supercontinent Pangaea. For Pangaea was breaking apart. The single vast landmass that had dominated the Triassic was cracking along ancient lines of geological weakness, its pieces drifting apart with a slowness that made even the sauropod's walking pace seem hurried. By the Middle Jurassic, the northern portion, Laurasia, was separating from the southern portion, Gondwana, with the Tethys Sea widening between them like a wound that the Earth could not close. And within these great fragments, smaller rifts were forming. North America was beginning to pull away from Africa. South America was starting its long, slow journey westward. India was still attached to Africa and Antarctica, a fragment of a fragment, waiting for the forces that would one day send it northward on a collision course with Asia, raising the Himalayas like a wall between two worlds. These continental movements shaped the Jurassic climate in ways both obvious and subtle. As the continents separated, new ocean currents formed in the spaces between them, carrying warm tropical water to higher latitudes and cool polar water toward the equator. Distributing heat more evenly, across the globe. The breakup of Pangaea also created new coastlines, thousands of miles of new coastline where there had been none before. And these coastlines brought moisture inland, feeding the forests, filling the rivers, maintaining the lush, green, dripping world that the dinosaurs called home. Whispers tell us of the air itself. The atmosphere of the Jurassic was different from our own. Not dramatically different, not alien, but subtly altered in ways that would have been perceptible to a modern visitor. The oxygen level was slightly lower than today, perhaps 16 to 18%, compared to our 21%, which may have affected the metabolic strategies of some organisms. But this reduction was not severe enough to prevent vigorous life, and many researchers believe it may have encouraged certain physiological adaptations. The air sac systems of the large dinosaurs, for instance, which allowed them to extract oxygen more efficiently than the simple in and out bellows of mammalian lungs. The sky itself. Imagine the Jurassic sky, free of every human artifact, no contrails, no satellites, no electric glow on the horizon from a city that has not yet been imagined. A sky of extraordinary clarity in the dry seasons, of extraordinary drama in the wet seasons when towering cumulus clouds built to heights of 50,000 feet and released their cargo in deluges that swelled every river and turned every floodplain into a shallow, temporary lake. At night, the stars blazed with an intensity that the modern eye, dimmed by light pollution, can scarcely imagine. The Milky Way, a thick white river overhead, the planets bright and steady, the moon, slightly closer to the Earth than it is now, slightly larger in the sky, its tidal pool slightly stronger, rising over the tree line with a silvered light that transformed the fern prairies into shimmering metallic landscapes and cast the shadows of the great conifers in long dark lines across the illuminated ground. And at sunset, at that sacred boundary between day and night, the Jurassic sky performed a ritual that the modern world rarely witnesses. As the sun descended toward the horizon, and its light passed through the thick, moisture-laden atmosphere at an increasingly oblique angle, the sky did not simply turn orange and pink and red, as it does in our drier, cleaner air. It turned green. A thin, luminous band of pale emerald light appeared at the horizon, trapped between the darkening earth below and the deepening blue above. A color created by the refraction of sunlight through the dense, humid atmosphere. A color that lasted only minutes before it too was swallowed by the approaching night. The green flash. The green afterglow. The sky's own way of reflecting back to the earth the color that dominated its surface. The green of the ferns, the green of the conifers, the green of the cycads, and the mosses, and the horsetails and the liverworts, and every other plant that clothed the Jurassic world in its uniform of emerald and jade and sage and lime, and every other shade of the color that the earth, in this particular age, seemed most determined to express. This was the world. This was the stage. This was the garden in which the giants would walk, the forest. Let us enter it now with the care and the reverence it deserves. For the Jurassic forest was not a backdrop. It was not scenery. It was not the passive container in which the more dramatic stories of predator and prey, of birth and death, of evolution and extinction played out. It was the story. It was the living, breathing, growing, dying, regenerating matrix within which all other stories were embedded. The medium through which every creature moved, from which every creature ate, upon which every creature depended for the air it breathed, and the shade it sought, and the water it drank, and the shelter it found when the great storms rolled in from the continental margins, and the sky turned black, and the rain fell in sheets that turned the forest floor into a shallow, rushing, debris-laden torrent. The forest was the world. And to understand the creatures that lived within it, we must first understand the forest itself. The canopy was dominated by conifers, not the conifers of the modern world, not the pines and spruces and firs that we associate with Christmas trees and cold mountain slopes, and the resinous scent of northern forests in winter. These were older conifers, more ancient lineages, families of trees that had been refining their architecture for over 100 million years before the first dinosaur ever took its first tentative step across a Triassic floodplain. The Araucaria were the cathedrals. These extraordinary trees, whose living descendants include the monkey puzzle tree of South America and the Norfolk Island pine of the South Pacific, grew to enormous heights in the Jurassic. Their trunks rose straight and columnar, with bark so deeply patterned and so richly textured that each tree appeared to have been individually sculpted by a craftsman of supernatural patience. The bark was arranged in overlapping spiral patterns, diamond-shaped plates that interlocked with their neighbors in a mosaic so regular and so geometric that it seemed designed rather than grown. Each plate was itself textured, rough, fissured, bearing the accumulated scars of decades of exposure to wind and rain and the occasional abrasion of a passing creature's flank. The Araucaria canopy was dense, extraordinarily dense. The branches extended outward from the main trunk in whorls, regular, symmetrical arrangements that gave each tree a layered, tiered appearance, like a pagoda or a wedding cake, or the stepped pyramid of some ancient Mesoamerican civilization that would not exist for another 140 million years. The needles were short, stiff, and dark green, overlapping closely on the branches, creating a surface so continuous that it functioned almost as a solid barrier, intercepting sunlight with extraordinary efficiency and casting the forest floor below into the deep, permanent, green-tinged twilight that we have already described. It is said that a forest of Araucaria in full maturity was one of the most impressive sights the natural world has ever produced. Imagine standing at the base of one of these trees and looking upward. The trunk rises before you like a column in a temple, dark, rough, massive, vanishing into the green haze above. At 30 feet, the first branches emerge, thick, horizontal, reaching outward like the arms of a cross. At 60 feet, another tier. At 90 feet, another. And above that, still another, layer upon layer, tier upon tier, each one slightly narrower than the last, each one casting its shadow upon the one below, the whole structure rising to a crown that, in the largest specimens, may have reached heights of 150 feet or more. Now multiply that tree by thousands, by tens of thousands. Imagine a landscape in which every direction you look, for as far as the eye can see, which in this forest is not far, perhaps a few hundred feet, before the mist and the green light dissolve all detail into luminous blur, is filled with these structures, these columns, these living pillars of wood and bark and needle and resin, rising from the soil with the quiet, absolute confidence of things that have been growing for centuries and will continue growing for centuries more, unless some force greater than themselves, a storm, a fire, the slow death of old age, the passage of a creature large enough to uproot them, intervenes. This was the world of the Araucaria, the upper canopy, the ceiling of the Jurassic cathedral. Beneath the Araucaria canopy grew another layer of forest, the understory. And here, the diversity was extraordinary. Cycads, these ancient plants, among the oldest seed-bearing plants on Earth, with a fossil record that stretches back to the Permian well over 250 million years, were everywhere in the Jurassic. They were, in a sense, the defining plants of the age. The Jurassic is sometimes called the Age of Cycads, and while this is an oversimplification, it captures something true. The cycads were the understory. They were the layer between the towering conifers above and the low-growing ferns below, filling the middle space with their distinctive forms. Thick, rough, barrel-shaped or columnar trunks, topped with crowns of stiff, leathery, pinnate fronds that radiated outward in symmetrical fans, giving each plant the appearance of a small palm tree. Though cycads are not related to palms at all. The cycad trunks were extraordinary in their own right. Covered in a persistent armor of old leaf bases, the remnants of fronds that had grown, served their purpose, died, and been shed, leaving behind their woody attachment points arranged in a spiral pattern up the trunk. They had the appearance of being wrapped in a kind of natural chainmail. This was not accidental. The leaf base armor served as protection against herbivores, against fire, against the abrasion of passing animals. And the spiral pattern in which the leaf bases were arranged was itself a thing of beauty, a mathematical precision that the cycad shared with sunflowers and pine cones, and galaxies and hurricanes and the shells of ammonites curled in the shallow Jurassic seas. The Fibonacci spiral, the golden ratio expressed in living tissue, a pattern so fundamental to the structure of the universe that it appears at every scale, from the molecular to the cosmic. Some believe that many species of herbivorous dinosaurs fed primarily on cycads. The fronds, though tough and leathery, contained nutrients that the dinosaurs' digestive systems, particularly the elaborate fermentation vats of the sauropods, could extract. The reproductive structures of cycads, large cone-like organs that produced seeds rich in fats and proteins, may also have been consumed, though some researchers note that many modern cycads produce seeds that are toxic to mammals and suggest that the same may have been true in the Jurassic, creating a complex web of chemical defense and adaptation between plant and herbivore that played out over millions of years of evolutionary dialogue. Beneath the cycads, the ferns. The ferns were the carpet, the floor, the living surface upon which the entire drama of the Jurassic forest was staged. They grew in layers, ground-hugging species that crept across the soil in low, dense mats, taller species that rose to waist height and formed a continuous canopy of their own, and tree ferns, those magnificent ancient structures whose trunks could reach heights of 30 feet or more, their crowns of delicate fronds spreading above the lower vegetation like green umbrellas, creating yet another layer of shade, yet another level of filtered light, yet another step in the gradient from the sun, drenched canopy above, to the dark, moist, mushroom-scented soil below. Each fern frond was a work of art, a masterpiece of natural geometry. The basic structure was simple, a central stem called a rachis, from which smaller stems branched, and from which smaller stems branched again, and again, and again, each level of branching producing smaller and more delicate copies of the overall form. This self-similar pattern, this repetition of shape at every scale, is what mathematicians call a fractal, and the ferns were among the first living things on Earth to express it. Millions of years before Mandelbrot gave the concept a name, the ferns were growing it, unfurling it, spiraling it outward from tight coiled buds. Fiddleheads we call them. Those sacred spirals that emerge each spring from the forest floor like the opening of an ancient scroll, into the flat, extended, light-catching surfaces that the plant needed to survive. The fiddlehead. Let us pause there for a moment. The fiddlehead of a fern. That tight, coiled spiral. The same spiral that appears in the nautilus shell, in the ammonite fossil, in the pattern of seeds in a sunflower head, in the arms of spiral galaxies turning in the void, is one of the oldest and most persistent shapes in the living world. The Jurassic forest floor, in spring or in the aftermath of a disturbance, would have been studded with them. Thousands of small, tightly coiled spirals rising from the dark soil like green springs being slowly released, each one containing, compressed within its coils, the entire future form of the frond it would become. There is something in this image that is almost too perfect, almost too symbolic, as if the earth, in creating the fern, had deliberately chosen the most sacred of all geometric forms. The spiral, the symbol of growth, of expansion, of the unfolding of potential, and embedded it at the very foundation of its greatest forest. And then there were the ginkgos, ancient, enduring, singular. The ginkgo is today the last surviving species of a lineage that was once vast and diverse. A family of trees that filled the Jurassic forests with their distinctive fan-shaped leaves and their peculiar, faintly malodorous fruit. But while their relatives have long since vanished, the ginkgo itself persists, unchanged, unimproved, unmodified by the 200 million years of evolutionary pressure that have reshaped virtually every other living thing on the planet. The ginkgo that grows in a city park today is, for all practical purposes, the same tree that grew in the Jurassic forest. The same leaf shape, the same branching pattern, the same biochemistry. A living fossil. A letter from the deep past, delivered intact, unopened, still bearing the same message it carried when the sauropods walked beneath its branches and the world was young. In the Jurassic, ginkgos grew abundantly. Their fan-shaped leaves, each one a small, flat, semicircular blade with radiating veins that divide and redivide in a pattern called dichotomous branching, would have been scattered across the forest floor in enormous quantities, creating a carpet of delicate pale green fans that, in the seasons of leaffall, would have turned golden before dropping, covering the ground in amber and pale yellow in a display that, set against the deep green of the ferns below and the dark green of the conifers above, must have been one of the most beautiful sights in the ancient world. Horsetails. In the wet places, along the riverbanks, in the marshes, in the shallow standing water of floodplains and oxbow lakes, and the low-lying areas where the water table reached the surface. The horsetails grew. These ancient plants, whose ancestors had been part of the Earth's forests for over 300 million years, were among the oldest living things in the Jurassic. Their design was simple and extraordinarily effective. Hollow, segmented stems, rising straight and tall from the wet soil, each segment connected to the next by a distinct joint. The whole structure topped with a cone-shaped strobilus that released clouds of fine spores into the warm, still air. The horsetails grew in dense thickets. Thousands of stems packed together in stands so tight that moving through them would have been like moving through a field of bamboo or a crowd of closely spaced pillars in an endless flooded hall. Mosses, liverworts, fungi. The forest floor, beneath the visible layers of fern and horsetail and cycad, was alive with organisms too small and too quiet to attract the attention of the great herbivores, but no less essential to the functioning of the whole. The mosses covered every surface, every stone, every fallen log, every exposed root, every inch of bark within their reach. In a plush, green, moisture-retaining carpet that served as both insulation and sponge, moderating temperature and retaining water in a system so efficient that even in the brief dry spells between rains, the forest floor remained moist, cool and hospitable to the countless small organisms that depended on it. The fungi, invisible for most of their lives, growing through the soil and the leaf litter in vast networks of thread-like hyphae. The fungi were the engine of decomposition. Every fallen leaf, every dead branch, every body that came to rest upon the forest floor was claimed by the fungi, broken down, dissolved, returned to the soil as nutrients that the roots of the living plants could absorb and use to grow. Without the fungi, the forest would have been buried in its own dead. Without the fungi, the nutrients locked in fallen organic matter would have remained locked, unavailable, inert. The fungi were the translators, the mediators between death and life, between the end of one generation and the beginning of the next, between the fallen and the rising, in an endless cycle that had no beginning and no end, only the continuous, patient, invisible turning of matter from one form to another. And beneath the fungi, beneath the soil, beneath everything, the mycorrhizal networks, the wood wide web, the vast interconnected lattice of fungal hyphae that linked the roots of every plant in the forest to every other plant in a communications network of extraordinary scope and complexity. Through these networks, nutrients were shared, signals were transmitted. The distress of one tree, attacked by herbivores, deprived of light, damaged by storm, could trigger chemical responses in neighboring trees, prompting them to increase their own defenses. The forest was not a collection of individuals. It was a community, an organism, a single, vast, breathing, dreaming, living entity that spanned thousands of acres and had been growing, adapting, responding to the world around it for millions of years. This was the forest. This was the garden. This was the living architecture within which the giants moved. We return now to the giants, to the creatures for whom this forest was built, or who were built for this forest, or who grew alongside this forest in a relationship so intertwined, so mutually dependent, so deeply rooted in the shared history of plant and animal, that it is impossible to say where one ends and the other begins. The sauropods. The word itself comes from the Greek, sauros, meaning lizard, and pous, meaning foot, lizard-footed. It is a modest name for the most extraordinary creatures the land has ever known. A name that focuses on the feet, on the single most practical, most grounded, most earth-connected aspect of an animal that was, in every other respect, an exercise in the transcendence of earthly limitations. The sauropods were not merely large. They were the largest. The absolute, unchallenged, unequaled largest animals ever to walk upon the solid surface of the planet. Not the largest to swim. The blue whale holds that distinction. Not the largest to float. Certain colonial organisms of the deep ocean may claim that. But the largest to stand, to walk, to press their weight into the soil and leave behind them a record of passage that would endure for geological ages. It is said that the sauropods first appeared in the late Triassic. Small bipedal or semi-bipedal creatures that bore only a faint resemblance to the titans they would become. But by the Jurassic, they had undergone one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of life. They had grown, and grown, and grown, as if the earth itself were expanding within them, as if some force deeper than natural selection, deeper than the blind mechanics of mutation and survival, were pushing them outward, upward, into dimensions of size that no other land animal had ever approached. By the late Jurassic, the Morrison Formation world of what is now Western North America, the Tendaguru Formation of what is now Tanzania, the Lourinhã Formation of what is now Portugal, the sauropods had reached their zenith. They were everywhere. They dominated every terrestrial ecosystem. They were the elephants, the giraffes, the bison, the cattle of their age, the great herbivores upon whose existence the entire structure of the Jurassic biosphere depended. Let us meet them, one by one, slowly, with the patience their memory deserves. Diplodocus. The name means double beam, a reference to the double beam chevron bones on the underside of its tail, a structural detail that, while important to anatomists, tells us almost nothing about what Diplodocus was like as a living creature. So let us speak instead of what it was. Diplodocus was long, extraordinarily, almost absurdly long. From the tip of its small, elongated skull to the end of its whip-like tail, it stretched over 80 feet. Some estimates suggest 90 feet or more for the largest individuals. This makes it one of the longest animals ever to live, a record it shares or contests with several close relatives. But its length was distributed in a particular way that gave it a silhouette unlike any other creature. The body was relatively compact, a barrel-shaped torso slung between 4 columnar legs, like a suspension bridge between 2 pairs of support pillars. The neck extended forward from the front of the body, long, flexible, and held, most researchers believe, at a relatively low angle, perhaps slightly elevated, but not the dramatically upright posture that older illustrations favored. And the tail, the extraordinary tail, extended backward from the body in a long, tapering, gradually thinning structure that ended in a whip-like tip of such fineness that it could have been used, some believe, to produce a sharp cracking sound, a sonic boom in miniature, that would have echoed through the Jurassic forest with a sound not unlike a gunshot. Imagine that sound. A a sharp crack breaking the green stillness. Not a roar. Diplodocus almost certainly could not roar, lacking the vocal apparatus for such a sound. Not a call. At least, not a call as we understand calling. But a crack. Sudden, sharp, and then gone, swallowed by the mist and the trees and the patient silence of the forest as quickly as it had appeared. A signal, perhaps. A warning. A territorial marker. Or simply a sound. One of the countless sounds that filled the Jurassic soundscape and that are now, like the creatures that made them, lost to the silence of deep time. Diplodocus fed low. Its neck, while long, was not designed for the high-reaching vertical browsing of some other sauropods. Instead, it swept, moving the neck side to side in broad, gentle arcs, stripping foliage from low-growing ferns and horsetails, and ground-level cycad fronds, with a mouth full of simple, pencil-shaped teeth that were designed for raking and stripping rather than chewing. The teeth were located at the very front of the jaw, a battery of forward-pointing pegs that closed around vegetation and pulled it free with a motion that combined the mechanics of a rake, a comb, and a pair of pliers. The stripped foliage was swallowed whole, unchewed, unmasticated, pushed down the long throat into the vast fermentation chamber of the gut, where colonies of bacteria, billions upon billions of microorganisms, performed the slow, warm alchemy of digestion, converting cellulose into energy, fern into flesh, green into the fuel that kept an 80-foot body alive. Some believe that Diplodocus could rear up on its hind legs, briefly perhaps, using its tail as a third point of contact with the ground, lifting its front end off the ground and reaching its head to heights it could not achieve from a four-legged stance. This is debated. The biomechanics are uncertain. But the image, an 80-foot creature standing upright, its neck reaching skyward, its small head silhouetted against the canopy, is one that the mind finds difficult to release once it has taken hold. Brachiosaurus. If Diplodocus was the longest, Brachiosaurus was the tallest. Its name means arm lizard, a reference to the fact that its forelimbs were significantly longer than its hind limbs, an unusual arrangement among sauropods that gave its body a distinctive upward slope, like a living hill, with its back rising from the hips to the shoulders, at an angle that naturally elevated the base of the neck above the level of the back. And what a neck! The neck of Brachiosaurus rose from the highest point of the body, from those elevated shoulders, and extended upward with a verticality that no other sauropod matched. Standing at full height, with its neck raised to its maximum comfortable angle, Brachiosaurus may have lifted its head 40 feet above the ground, perhaps higher. Some estimates suggest 43 feet, 45. The exact figure depends on assumptions about the flexibility of the neck vertebrae, the angle at which the neck attached to the body, and the degree to which the living animal could extend beyond the limits suggested by the bones alone. But even the most conservative estimates place the head of Brachiosaurus higher than any other creature that has ever walked the earth. Higher than the highest giraffe by a factor of 3. Higher than the roof of a 3-story building. Higher than many of the trees in the modern forests that have replaced the ancient landscapes it once knew. Whispers tell us of the cardiovascular challenge. To pump blood from a heart at chest level to a brain 40 feet above, against the relentless pull of gravity through a column of blood that exerted its own enormous downward pressure, required a heart of extraordinary power and a vascular system of extraordinary sophistication. Some believe that the heart of a large Brachiosaurus may have weighed over 400 pounds and generated a blood pressure several times higher than that of any modern animal. Others propose that the neck was not held as vertically as some reconstructions suggest, or that the animal had special adaptations. Rete mirabile networks, elastic artery walls, gravitational valves, that reduce the cardiovascular cost of its extraordinary reach. The truth, as with so many things about these creatures, remains veiled. We have the bones, we have the trackways, we have the context of the world in which they lived. But the soft tissue, the muscles, the blood vessels, the heart, the lungs, the intricate plumbing of a body that was, in effect, a building-sized living machine, is gone. Returned to the soil, dissolved into the chemistry of the earth, leaving behind only the stone framework from which we must reconstruct, with imagination and with care, the living creature that once inhabited it. Brachiosaurus was a high browser. Where Diplodocus swept the ground, Brachiosaurus reached the sky. It fed from the canopy, from the highest branches of the tallest trees, from the places where no other mouth could follow, where the leaves were freshest and the competition was zero. It was the giraffe of the Jurassic, but taller, vastly taller, and slower, and heavier, and more patient, moving through the forest with a ponderous grace that belied its immense mass, reaching upward with that extraordinary neck, its small head disappearing into the canopy as it browsed, its jaws working with simple, efficient motions that stripped leaves from branches, with the mechanical precision of a machine designed for a single task and perfected over millions of years. Some believe that Brachiosaurus may have weighed as much as 60 tons. Others suggest more. Others suggest less. The estimates vary because the methods of estimation are inherently uncertain, based on scaling equations derived from modern animals, on volumetric models of the body, on assumptions about the density of bone and muscle and organ that may or may not apply to a creature so far removed from anything living today, that comparison becomes almost meaningless. But even the lowest estimates place Brachiosaurus among the heaviest land animals ever to have existed. A creature whose weight was supported on 4 legs that, despite their enormous size, were proportioned with a structural elegance that would impress an engineer. The limb bones were designed to bear load, thick-walled straight, or centered, vertically, to minimize bending stress. Their joints broad and flat to distribute force across the maximum possible area. The feet were broad and padded, spreading under the animal's weight, like the foundations of a building, preventing the creature from sinking into all but the softest ground. Apatosaurus, once called Brontosaurus, thunder lizard, a name that was taken away by the cold precision of taxonomic priority rules, then given back in recent years by researchers who determined that the two names did, in fact, refer to different genera. Apatosaurus means deceptive lizard, a name given by Othniel Charles Marsh in 1877, because the chevron bones of its tail reminded him of those of certain marine reptiles. A deception of anatomy, a case of mistaken identity written in bone. But it is the other name, the name that was stripped away and then restored, that resonates. Brontosaurus, thunder lizard. A name that captures something essential about this creature that no scientific measurement, no anatomical description, no cladistic analysis can convey. The thunder, the deep, low, bone-shaking vibration of a creature whose footsteps were not mere steps, but events. Compressions of the earth that sent tremors outward through the soil in concentric waves, felt by every creature within a radius of hundreds of feet, perhaps more. Apatosaurus was shorter necked than Diplodocus, but far more heavily built. Its body was thick, muscular, barrel-shaped. A powerhouse of a torso mounted on legs that were shorter relative to its body length than those of Brachiosaurus, but no less massive, no less formidably constructed. Its neck was relatively stout and muscular, capable of powerful lateral sweeping motions that would have allowed it to clear large areas of vegetation with each pass. And its tail, like that of Diplodocus, was long tapering, and potentially capable of producing the same whip-crack sounds that may have echoed through the Jurassic forests. Some believe that Apatosaurus was semi-aquatic, that it spent significant time in rivers and lakes, using the water to support its enormous weight while feeding on aquatic and semi-aquatic vegetation. This idea was popular for much of the 20th century, but has largely fallen out of favor. The trackway evidence suggests that Apatosaurus was fully terrestrial, that it walked on land with the same confidence and the same earth-shaking presence as its relatives, and that its massive body was supported entirely by its own musculature and skeletal architecture. No water required. It is said that Apatosaurus may have weighed between 20 and 30 tons, heavier than Diplodocus but lighter than Brachiosaurus. But weight, in the case of the sauropods, is almost beside the point. What mattered was not how much they weighed, but what they were, what they represented, what they meant to the world they inhabited, and to the world that would one day discover their bones and give them names that sound, even now, like incantations from a sacred text. Camarasaurus, the most common sauropod in the Morrison Formation, and perhaps the most underappreciated. Its name means chambered lizard, a reference to the hollow chambers within its vertebrae. A weight-saving adaptation that allowed it to be large without being impossibly heavy, strong without being rigid, flexible without being weak. Camarasaurus was shorter and more compact than its more famous relatives, perhaps 50 to 65 feet in length, with a proportionally shorter neck and tail, and a heavier, more robustly built skull. Its teeth were different too. Larger, spoon-shaped, more heavily built than the delicate pencil teeth of Diplodocus, suggesting a different feeding strategy. Camarasaurus was not a raker or a stripper. It was a chomper, biting off tougher vegetation, processing coarser plant material, occupying a different niche in the same forest that Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus also called home. This is a crucial point, and one worth pausing over. The Jurassic forests supported not one species of giant herbivore, but many, at least 6 or 7 species of large sauropod in the Morrison Formation alone, all living in the same general area, all feeding on plants, all moving through the same landscape. How did they coexist? How did the forest support so many enormous mouths? The answer, some believe, lies in niche partitioning. The same principle that allows modern African savannas to support elephants, giraffes, buffalo, zebra, and wildebeest simultaneously. Each species feeds on different plants, or on different parts of the same plants, or at different heights, or in different habitats. Brachiosaurus reached the canopy. Diplodocus swept to the ground. Camarasaurus bit through tougher mid-level vegetation. Each species occupied its own particular niche, its own particular slice of the available resources, and together they filled the forest with a diversity of giant herbivores that has no parallel in the modern world. There were others, many others. The Jurassic was not a world of half a dozen species, but of hundreds, of thousands, most of them still unknown, still buried, still sleeping in the stone. Barosaurus, closely related to Diplodocus, but even longer, with a neck that may have stretched over 30 feet, and that some believe could have been raised to a near vertical position, giving the animal a reach of over 40 feet. Imagine Barosaurus rearing up and extending its neck. A creature taller than a building, visible above the treetops for miles. Its silhouette against the Jurassic sky as distinctive as a lighthouse on a coastline. Haplocanthosaurus, a more primitive sauropod, smaller and less specialized than its contemporaries. A living echo of an earlier stage of sauropod evolution, still walking the Morrison Formation landscape alongside its more derived relatives like a relic from an older world. Supersaurus, whose name speaks for itself. One of the longest animals ever to have lived, with length estimates ranging from 100 to 110 feet. A creature that, if it stood on the 50-yard line of a modern football field, would have extended from one end zone to the other. These are just the ones we know. The ones whose bones have been found, prepared, studied, named, and published. For every sauropod species we have identified, there are likely several more that we have not. Species whose bones lie undiscovered in rock formations that have not yet been exposed by erosion, or that were exposed and then destroyed by weathering before anyone found them, or that were preserved in conditions that did not permit fossilization at all, leaving no trace, no record. No evidence that they ever existed except, perhaps, as a faint chemical signature in a layer of ancient soil. The garden was fuller than we know, the procession longer, the congregation of giants more diverse, more numerous, more magnificent than the fossil record, with all its extraordinary richness, can fully reveal. Some believe the sauropods moved in herds, not random aggregations, not temporary gatherings at water sources or feeding sites, but true herds, organized, structured, multi-generational groups that traveled together across the Jurassic landscape, following routes that may have been walked by their ancestors for thousands, perhaps millions of years. The evidence comes from trackways, in several locations around the world, in the Morrison Formation, in the Jurassic limestones of Portugal, in the ancient lakebeds of China. Researchers have found extensive sauropod trackways in which dozens of individuals appear to have been walking together in the same direction at the same time. The tracks show a range of sizes: large adults, medium-sized sub-adults, and small juveniles, walking in parallel, sometimes with the smaller tracks placed within the larger ones, as if the young were walking alongside or between the legs of the adults. It is said that in some of these trackways, the adult tracks show a consistent orientation, all heading the same direction, all spaced at similar intervals, while the juvenile tracks are more erratic, more variable, more exploratory, as if the young ones were wandering back and forth within the protective envelope of the herd, testing the boundaries of their freedom while remaining within the safety of the group. There is something in these trackways that moves beyond science. Something that speaks not to the anatomist or the biomechanist, but to the heart. The image of a herd of sauropods, adults and young, moving together through the green twilight of the Jurassic forest, following a path that generations have walked before, evokes a feeling of tenderness, of care, of community, that we do not expect from creatures separated from us by 150 million years of evolution. And yet there it is, written in stone. The young walking beside the old, the herd moving as one. The ancient wordless compact between parent and child, between elder and youth, between those who know the way and those who are learning it. Whispers tell us of migration. Some researchers believe that certain sauropod herds may have been migratory, moving between regions on a seasonal basis, following the rains, following the growth of new vegetation, traveling distances of hundreds of miles in slow, patient, undramatic journeys that unfolded over weeks or months. The evidence for this is indirect. Isotopic analyses of sauropod teeth that suggest dietary changes consistent with movement between different habitats. Trackway evidence that points to directional travel over long distances. The analogy with modern large herbivores like elephants and wildebeest that undertake similar migrations. If the sauropods did migrate, the spectacle would have been beyond anything the modern world can offer. Imagine a column of giants, perhaps 100 individuals, perhaps more, moving across a Jurassic floodplain at dawn. The adults in the center, the young along the flanks. The dust rising from their passage in a cloud, visible for miles. The ground trembling beneath them. The sound, not roaring, not calling, just the deep, constant, rhythmic percussion of 100 bodies moving in unison. Footsteps overlapping, tails swaying, necks undulating. The whole procession advancing with a slowness that is not hesitation but patience, not lethargy, but the calm, deliberate momentum of creatures that have all the time in the world and know exactly where they are going. And behind them, where the herd has passed, the earth bears witness. The footprints, thousands of footprints, round and deep, and filled with the imprint of the padded feet that made them, stretching in parallel lines to the horizon, a roadway written in mud by the passage of the largest parade the world has ever seen. Let us pause now from the spectacle of the external from the silhouettes and the footprints and the trackways, and turn inward, into the bodies of the giants themselves, into the extraordinary machinery that made their existence possible. The skeleton of a sauropod is a marvel of engineering. Every bone, every joint, every structural element has been shaped by natural selection to solve the fundamental problem of supporting and moving an enormous body on land against the constant, unforgiving pull of gravity. The vertebrae are perhaps the most extraordinary. In many sauropod species, the vertebrae, particularly those of the neck and back, are not solid bone, but elaborately hollowed structures, riddled with internal chambers and air-filled spaces called pneumatic fossae. These chambers were connected, in life, to an extensive system of air sacs that permeated the body, extending from the lungs into the vertebrae, the ribs, and sometimes even the limb bones. This air sac system served multiple purposes. It reduced the weight of the skeleton without reducing its strength, like the hollow steel tubes used in modern construction, which are lighter than solid rods but just as resistant to bending and compression. It also improved the efficiency of breathing, allowing air to flow through the lungs in a continuous, unidirectional stream rather than the back-and-forth tidal flow of mammalian respiration. It is said that this breathing system was one of the key innovations that allowed the sauropods to achieve their extraordinary size. A mammal the size of a sauropod would not be able to breathe efficiently enough to survive. The volume of dead space in its lungs, the energy cost of moving such a large volume of air in and out, would exceed the capacity of the mammalian respiratory system. But the sauropods were not mammals. They were dinosaurs, inheritors of the air sac system first developed by their Archosaurian ancestors, refined over millions of years, and expanded to a degree of complexity and efficiency that no other group of land animals has ever matched. The bones of the limbs were designed for weight bearing, thick-walled columnar, with flat, broad joint surfaces that distributed compressive forces evenly across the maximum possible area. The arrangement of the limbs was graviportal, a term that describes the posture of very large, heavy animals whose limbs are held straight and vertical beneath the body, like the legs of a table, rather than angled outward in the splayed posture of smaller, more agile creatures. This graviportal stance minimized the bending forces on the limb bones, reducing the energy cost of supporting the body and allowing the animal to stand for extended periods without muscular fatigue. The feet were broad and elephantine, five-toed with a thick, resilient pad of cartilage and connective tissue that cushioned each step and distributed the animal's weight across the full surface of the foot. In some species, the forefeet bore claws, large curved structures that may have been used for defense or for gripping soft ground during locomotion. The hind feet typically had 3 claws. The overall design was one of stability and durability. Feet built to carry enormous weight over enormous distances, step after step, for the entire duration of a life that may have lasted 50 years, 60 years, perhaps even a century. The digestive system. We cannot see it in the fossils. Soft tissue does not fossilize under normal circumstances, but we can infer its general design from the evidence of the teeth, the skull, the body proportions, and the known biology of modern herbivores. The sauropods did not chew their food. Their teeth, whether the pencil-like pegs of Diplodocus or the spoon-shaped blades of Camarasaurus, were designed for acquisition, not processing. They stripped vegetation, they bit it off, they pulled it free, and then they swallowed it whole, sending it down the long throat into the vast fermentation chamber of the gut. Some believe that sauropods may have swallowed stones, gastroliths, that sat in a muscular section of the stomach and helped to mechanically break down the tough plant material that the teeth had not processed. This is debated. Polished stones have been found in association with some sauropod skeletons, but their interpretation is uncertain. Were they deliberately swallowed? Were they accidentally ingested with food? Were they washed into the body cavity after death by the same geological processes that buried and preserved the skeleton? The question remains open. Another small mystery in the vast cathedral of unknowns that surrounds these creatures. What is not debated is the sheer volume of food that a large sauropod must have consumed. A 60-ton Brachiosaurus, maintaining its body temperature and fueling its basic metabolic processes, would have needed to consume hundreds of pounds of vegetation every day. Perhaps 1,000 pounds or more by some estimates. This is an extraordinary quantity, and it helps to explain why the sauropods spent virtually all of their waking hours eating, browsing continuously, moving slowly through the forest, processing the landscape through their bodies with the steady, inexorable efficiency of a combine harvester moving through a field of grain. The heart. We cannot see it, but we can imagine it. Buried deep within the chest cavity, protected by the enormous ribcage, the heart of a large sauropod must have been a structure of extraordinary power. Some estimates suggest it may have weighed 300 to 400 pounds in the largest species. It would have beaten slowly, perhaps once every few seconds, each beat driving a massive volume of blood through a vascular system that extended from the tip of the tail to the top of the head, covering a distance of 30, 40, 50 feet in some species. The blood pressure, particularly in the high-necked species like Brachiosaurus, must have been remarkable, far higher than in any modern animal, requiring arterial walls of extraordinary thickness and elasticity, and valves and regulatory mechanisms of extraordinary sophistication to prevent the catastrophic consequences of such extreme pressure, stroke, aneurysm, hemorrhage. And yet they lived. For millions of years they lived. The system worked. The heart pumped. The blood flowed. The brain received its oxygen. The muscles received their fuel. And the great body, that impossible, magnificent 60-ton living machine, walked and ate and breathed and continued, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. For a span of time that makes every human achievement seem as brief and as fragile as a single heartbeat in the dark. Beneath the silence of the sauropod's passage, there was sound, not the dramatic roaring of popular imagination. The fossil evidence suggests that most sauropods lacked the anatomical structures necessary for producing loud, complex vocalizations. But sound nonetheless. The sound of the footsteps, deep, rhythmic, percussive, felt through the ground as much as heard through the air. The sound of vegetation being stripped, the snap and tear of fronds pulled from stems, the rustle of leaves disturbed by the passage of enormous bodies. The sound of breathing, deep, slow, the rush of air through nostrils the size of dinner plates, in and out, with the measured rhythm of an ocean tide. Some believe that the whip-crack tails of Diplodocus and its relatives were used to produce sound, sharp supersonic cracks that would have echoed through the Jurassic landscape with startling clarity. Research on the biomechanics of these tail tips has shown that the tapered structure, if swung with sufficient force, could have exceeded the speed of sound, producing a genuine sonic boom. A sound that, in the enclosed space of a forest, would have been percussive and unmistakable. Others propose that sauropods may have produced low-frequency sounds, infrasound, by vibrating their enormous bodies or by vocalizing at frequencies too low for the human ear to detect. Modern elephants use infrasound to communicate over distances of several miles, and it is not unreasonable to suggest that sauropods, with their even larger bodies and their even more resonant body cavities, may have done the same. Imagine the Jurassic forest permeated with sounds below the threshold of hearing. Deep, rumbling communications passing between members of a herd, coordinating movement, maintaining contact, expressing states of being that we cannot name because we have no experience of what it is like to be a creature of such size, such patience, such fundamentally alien existence. Now let us turn to the predators. Let us move to the other side of the equation. To the creatures whose role in this ancient world was not to grow and to feed and to wander, but to watch, to wait, to patrol the boundaries of the garden and to maintain, through their presence, the balance without which the garden itself would collapse. For a garden of unchecked growth is not a garden at all. It is a tangle, an incoherence, a system without regulation, without feedback, without the essential mechanism of limitation that prevents any single species from consuming everything and leaving nothing behind. The predators were that mechanism. They were the Earth's way of saying enough, not cruelly, not vindictively, but with the quiet, impersonal necessity of a thermostat regulating the temperature of a room. Without the predators, the herbivores would have consumed the vegetation faster than it could regenerate. Without the predators, the weak and the sick would have survived to reproduce, passing on their vulnerabilities. Without the predators, the exquisite calibration of the Jurassic ecosystem, the delicate, interlocking, interdependent web of relationships that allowed so many species to coexist in the same landscape, would have unraveled. The predators didn't create the balance. They served it. They were instruments of a harmony that required no conductor, no score, no conscious intention. Only the ancient, patient, self-correcting wisdom of an ecosystem that had been tuning itself for billions of years. Allosaurus, the most well-known predator of the late Jurassic and one of the best understood theropod dinosaurs in the fossil record. Its name means different lizard, a name given by Othniel Charles Marsh in 1877 based on the unusual concavity of its vertebrae, which distinguished it from other theropods known at the time. It is a modest name for a creature that was, in its time and place, the apex predator of an entire continent. Allosaurus was large. Adults reached lengths of 28 to 33 feet, with the largest individuals perhaps approaching 40 feet. They stood approximately 10 to 12 feet tall at the hip and weighed between 1.5 and 2.5 tons. These are impressive numbers, but they do not capture the animal's presence. The way it would have looked, standing at the edge of a clearing in the Morrison Formation forest, its body held in the characteristic theropod posture, torso tilted forward, tail extended behind as a counterbalance, head held high and alert, eyes scanning, nostrils flaring, every sense attuned to the environment in a state of readiness that was not tension but focus. The skull of Allosaurus was a masterpiece of predatory engineering. Over 3 feet long in the largest individuals, it was relatively narrow and tall, with a large fenestrae, openings, that reduced its weight while maintaining its structural strength. The jaws were lined with dozens of teeth, curved, serrated, blade-like, each one designed with a precision that speaks of millions of years of refinement. The serrations on the tooth edges were not random. They were regularly spaced, consistently shaped, and sized in a way that maximized their cutting efficiency. Like the teeth of a steak knife, but perfected over evolutionary timescales that no human technology can approach. It is said that Allosaurus may not have bitten its prey in the manner of a crocodile or a lion, clamping down with enormous force and holding on. Instead, some researchers propose that it used its upper jaw as a hatchet, swinging its head downward with mouth open, driving the upper teeth into the flesh of its prey, tearing a chunk free and pulling back. The jaw hinge of Allosaurus allowed the mouth to open remarkably wide, wider than the jaw musculature alone would suggest. A design feature that, in combination with the relatively delicate lower jaw, supports the idea of a slash-and-tear feeding strategy rather than a clamp-and-hold one. The arms of Allosaurus were large and powerful, much larger, proportionally, than the famously tiny arms of Tyrannosaurus rex, which would not appear for another 80 million years. Each arm ended in a 3-fingered hand bearing large, strongly curved claws, the largest of which measured over 6 inches along the outer curve. These were not vestigial structures. They were weapons, tools of predation, instruments of grip and control that would have been used to seize, to hold, to rake, to wound, working in concert with the teeth and the jaws in a coordinated attack that would have been, for any herbivore on the receiving end, devastating. But we must not dwell on the violence. The predator's role was not defined by its moments of killing, which were, in the grand scheme of its existence, rare events, but by its continuous ongoing presence. An Allosaurus spent the vast majority of its time doing what all predators do, watching, waiting, moving through its territory with the unhurried patience of something that knows its next meal is out there somewhere and will present itself when the time is right. It was the waiting that defined the predator. The patience, the quiet, attentive, endlessly vigilant presence at the margins of the herd, at the edges of the forest, at the thresholds between one habitat and another. Whispers tell us of the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry, a site in central Utah, where the bones of more than 40 individual Allosaurus have been recovered from a single deposit of Morrison Formation mudstone, along with the remains of several herbivorous dinosaurs. The site is extraordinary. The densest concentration of Jurassic theropod remains anywhere in the world, and its interpretation has been debated for decades. Why were so many predators in one place? Some believe it was a predator trap, a sticky, miring patch of mud into which herbivores wandered and became stuck, attracting predators who then became stuck themselves, one after another, over years or decades, in a slow accumulation of death that continued until the conditions changed and the trap was sealed by new sediment. Others propose that it was a drought-reduced watering hole, a last remaining source of water in a dry season, around which predators and prey alike gathered in desperate concentrations. Others suggest it was a feeding site, a place where a large carcass attracted multiple predators who then fought among themselves, sustaining injuries that led to their deaths. The truth remains veiled. The bones tell us where the animals died. They tell us how many. They tell us the ages and the sizes and the species. But they do not tell us why. The why remains hidden in the silence between the bones, in the spaces where the soft tissue once was, in the moments of decision and behavior and circumstance that no fossil can preserve. Ceratosaurus, a smaller but no less fascinating predator whose name means horned lizard. Ceratosaurus bore a distinctive nasal horn, a blade-like projection on the midline of its snout, visible in the skull as a roughened boss of bone that, in life, supported a keratinous covering. Additional smaller ridges or hornlets above the eyes gave the face a crowned appearance. Ornamented, ceremonial, marked. The purpose of how the horn is debated. It was too small and too fragile to have served as an effective weapon against the thick-skinned, heavily armored herbivores of the Morrison Formation. More likely, it served a display function, a visual signal that communicated species identity, individual fitness or social dominance to other Ceratosaurus. Some believe it may have been brightly colored in life, flushed with blood perhaps, making it redden during displays of aggression or courtship, the way the comb of a rooster reddens and swells. Ceratosaurus was smaller than Allosaurus, perhaps 20 feet in length, weighing perhaps a ton, but it occupied a different niche. Its teeth were proportionally longer and more blade-like. Its body was more flexible, more sinuous. Its tail bore a row of small osteoderms, bony scutes embedded in the skin, that are unusual for a theropod and suggest a lineage with a different evolutionary history from the mainstream Allosaurid predators. Some researchers believe that Ceratosaurus may have been a more aquatic or semi-aquatic predator than Allosaurus, hunting along waterways, feeding on fish and small crocodilians, and the medium-sized dinosaurs that came to drink at river edges. Torvosaurus, the shadow, the one that appears in the fossil record like a rumor, glimpsed, recognized, and then lost again to the silence of incomplete preservation. Its name means savage lizard, though savagery is perhaps the wrong word. every predator is savage from the perspective of its prey. From its own perspective, it is simply doing what it was made to do. Torvosaurus was large, possibly rivaling or exceeding Allosaurus in size. Some estimates suggest lengths of 33 to 36 feet, with corresponding masses of perhaps 2 to 4 tons. Its skull was massive and deep, its teeth enormous, its arms powerful, bearing hands with enormous curved claws. It was, by any measure, one of the most formidable land predators of the Jurassic. But Torvosaurus is rare. Its fossils are uncommon compared to the abundance of Allosaurus remains. This may reflect a genuinely lower population density. Top predators are always rarer than their prey, and the largest predators are rarest of all. Or it may reflect a preference for habitats or behaviors that were less conducive to fossilization. Torvosaurus moves through the late Jurassic like a whisper, present, powerful, but elusive. Its story is incomplete. Its role in the ecosystem is imperfectly understood. It is one of the garden's deepest silences, a mystery preserved not in what we have found, but in what we have not. The armored ones. And now let us turn to the patient ones, the slow ones, the creatures who carried their protection, not in speed, not in size, not in the sharp weapons of the predators, but in the ancient and patient architecture of bone and plate and spike that covered their bodies like the walls of a living fortress. Stegosaurus. The name means roofed lizard, a name given by Marsh, based on his initial belief that the plates lay flat across the animal's back, like the tiles of a roof. This interpretation was incorrect. The plates stood upright, arranged in 2 alternating rows along the spine. But the name persisted, as names often do, outliving the era that gave them birth. Stegosaurus was large, up to 30 feet in length, weighing perhaps 5 to 7 tons. Its body was massively built, with powerful hind legs significantly longer than its front legs, giving it a distinctive arch-backed silhouette. Highest at the hips, sloping downward toward both the head and the tail. The head was remarkably small, disproportionately so, carried at the end of a short neck at a level close to the ground, suggesting that Stegosaurus was a low browser, feeding on ferns, mosses, ground-level cycad fronds, and other vegetation within 3 feet or so of the soil. But the head is not what anyone remembers about Stegosaurus. What everyone remembers? What has made this creature one of the most recognizable dinosaurs in the world? A silhouette that every child can identify. Are the plates. 17 plates. 17 broad, flat, diamond-shaped structures of bone standing upright along the spine, from just behind the skull to midway down the tail. The largest plates, positioned over the hips, were over 2 feet tall and nearly as wide. They were thin, remarkably thin for their size, some barely an inch thick at the center. And they were not directly attached to the vertebrae. Instead, they were embedded in the skin, anchored by their bases in the tough connective tissue of the back, standing upright like the sails of a ship or the fins of a fish, or, and this is the image that the mind cannot release, the standing stones of an ancient ritual site, arranged along the ridge of a living hill. The bone of each plate was not solid. It was permeated with a dense network of channels and grooves, the fossilized traces of blood vessels that, in life, carried blood close to the surface of the plate. This vascular network is the key to the mystery. Armor does not need blood vessels. A shield does not need to be warm. The plates of Stegosaurus were clearly designed by the slow, patient, blind but extraordinarily effective hand of natural selection to carry blood to their surfaces, to interact with the external environment, to function not as dead protection, but as living structures intimately connected to the animal's physiology. Some believe they were thermoregulatory, solar panels, heat exchangers, structures that could absorb warmth from the sun or release excess heat into the air, depending on the animal's needs. Blood flowing through the vascular channels would have carried heat into or away from the body, creating a sophisticated temperature management system built into the very architecture of the creature's spine. Others believe they served a display function. Visual signals, flags, banners, structures that communicated information to other Stegosaurus. Species identity, individual health, reproductive status, emotional state. Flushed with blood, the plates may have changed color, reddening, darkening, perhaps even producing patterns of color change that conveyed specific meanings to observers who knew how to read them. Imagine a Stegosaurus standing on a hilltop at dawn, the first light of the Jurassic sun striking its plates from behind, illuminating them like stained glass windows in a cathedral of bone, the blood within them glowing faintly through the keratinous surface as the creature turned slowly to face the light. Some believe the plates served both purposes, and others still. Protection, yes. Not against the direct bite of an Allosaurus, which could easily have shattered the thin bone, but against the casual approach of a smaller predator who, seeing the plates, might calculate that this particular meal was more trouble than it was worth. Thermoregulation, yes. Display, yes. And perhaps something else. Something that no single theory captures. Something that the Earth placed there for reasons that science has not yet articulated and may never fully articulate. The plates remain veiled in sacred uncertainty. And that uncertainty, rather than frustrating us, invites us deeper into the quiet space where knowledge ends and wonder begins. At the end of the tail, Stegosaurus carried 4 spikes, long, sharp, conical, arranged in 2 pairs that projected outward and slightly backward. This is the thagomizer, the defensive weapon that turns the lumbering, low-headed, small-brained Stegosaurus into something far more formidable than its gentle appearance might suggest. Fossil evidence confirms that these spikes were used. An Allosaurus caudal vertebra from the Morrison Formation bears a puncture wound that matches the size and shape of a Stegosaurus tail spike exactly. A wound that shows signs of infection, suggesting that the Allosaurus survived the encounter but was seriously injured. The Stegosaurus was not passive. When threatened, it could swing its heavy, muscular tail with devastating force, driving those 4 spikes into the flesh of any predator that approached from behind or from the side. The combination of slow, patient, ground-level browsing and sudden, powerful, spike-driven defense created a survival strategy that was extraordinarily effective. Effective enough to sustain the Stegosaurus lineage for approximately 10 million years, from roughly 155 to 145 million years ago. The smaller worlds. The Jurassic was not a world of giants alone. Beneath the notice of the great sauropods and the watchful predators and the armored wanderers, 1,000 smaller dramas played out every day, each one as important to its participants as any encounter between Allosaurus and Stegosaurus, each one contributing to the vast, interconnected, endlessly complex web of life that made the Jurassic ecosystem function. The ornithopods moved through the undergrowth with a lightness that the great sauropods could never achieve. Creatures like Dryosaurus, bipedal, agile, their bodies built for speed rather than size, darted through the fern forests, their sharp eyes scanning for food and danger simultaneously. They were the gazelles of the Jurassic, prey animals whose primary defense was awareness and acceleration, capable of bursting from a standing start to a full sprint in seconds, their powerful hind legs propelling them through the undergrowth with a speed and agility that made them difficult targets for all but the most skilled predators. Camptosaurus was larger, a more robust ornithopod that could walk on 2 legs or 4, browsing at heights from ground level to perhaps 6 feet. Filling the ecological role of a medium-sized herbivore in a world otherwise dominated by the extremely large and the extremely small. Its teeth were arranged in a dental battery, rows of closely packed teeth that functioned as a grinding surface, allowing it to chew its food, a capability that the sauropods lacked, and that may have given Camptosaurus and its relatives a dietary advantage in processing tougher vegetation. Othnielia, tiny, fast, barely 3 feet long, darted through the leaf litter like a bird, snatching insects, seeds, and tender plant shoots with a nimbleness that seems impossible in a world of giants. Named after Othniel Charles Marsh himself, this small ornithischian occupied the lowest tier of the dinosaurian community. The mouse roll, the shrew roll, the small and fast and numerous roll that is essential to every ecosystem but rarely celebrated. The pterosaurs soared above the canopy. These were not dinosaurs. They were a separate lineage of archosaurs that had independently evolved powered flight, spreading their membranous wings between elongated fourth fingers and their hind limbs, creating airfoils of extraordinary efficiency. The Jurassic pterosaurs were diverse, ranging from small insectivorous species with wingspans of a few feet to larger forms that soared over the shallow seas, plucking fish from the surface with their elongated, tooth-lined jaws. Rhamphorhynchus, with its long tail ending in a diamond-shaped vein, its narrow wings and its forward-projecting teeth, was one of the most common Jurassic pterosaurs, known from beautifully preserved specimens in the Solnhofen limestone of Germany. It was a fish-eater, a creature of the coast and the lagoon, spending its days skimming the warm, shallow waters of the Tethys Sea margins, hunting the small fish and squid that teemed in the sunlit shallows. And in the canopy, in the high interlocking branches of the Araucaria trees, small creatures moved that carried within their bodies the seeds of something extraordinary. Some of the earliest feathered dinosaurs, small theropods with filamentous integumentary structures covering their bodies, may already have been present in the late Jurassic. The evidence is fragmentary, but it hints at a world in which the boundary between earth and sky was already being questioned, already being tested, already being slowly dissolved by creatures that would, over the next 50 million years, give rise to the birds. In the waters, in the rivers and lakes and marshes of the Jurassic landscape, another world entirely existed. Crocodilians of various sizes and specializations haunted the waterways. Some were small, no larger than a cat, with slender snouts designed for catching fish and frogs. Others were larger, up to 15 or 20 feet in length, capable of taking prey as large as a medium-sized dinosaur that ventured too close to the water's edge. The crocodilians of the Jurassic were more diverse than their modern descendants, occupying a wider range of ecological niches and exhibiting a greater variety of body forms and feeding strategies. Turtles moved through the shallows, their shells already refined by over 100 million years of evolution into the efficient, protective, portable shelters that they remain today. Fish, lungfish, bowfins, gars, and primitive ray-finned species fill the waters in enormous numbers, providing food for the pterosaurs above and the crocodilians alongside, and the small theropod dinosaurs that waded into the shallows to hunt. Amphibians, frogs and salamanders and their relatives, inhabited the wet margins of every body of water, their calls adding to the nocturnal soundscape a quality that would be instantly recognizable to a modern listener, even across the gulf of 150 million years. And the insects. The insects were everywhere. Dragonflies patrolled the margins of lakes and rivers with wingspans of several inches, their iridescent bodies catching the green-filtered light as they hawked smaller insects in midair. Beetles crawled through the leaf litter in extraordinary numbers and diversity. The Coleoptera were already, by the Jurassic, well on their way to becoming the most species-rich order of insects on Earth. Moths and their relatives fluttered through the twilight of the understory. Flies, wasps, and their kin buzzed through the clearings. Termites, those ancient and industrious architects of the insect world, built their mounds and their galleries in the dead wood that littered the forest floor. breaking down cellulose with the help of their symbiotic gut organisms and returning the nutrients of fallen trees to the soil. The hum of insect life was a constant background, a vibration woven into the fabric of the Jurassic soundscape, present always, noticed never, like the hum of a refrigerator in a modern kitchen, or the distant rush of traffic on a highway. A sound so continuous and so pervasive that it became, for the creatures that lived within it, indistinguishable from silence itself. The nesting grounds beneath the silence of the great migrations and the daily drama of feeding and fleeing. The most intimate acts of the Jurassic world took place in the nesting grounds. The places where eggs were laid, where the next generation began its long journey from mineral shell to living flesh. It is said that dinosaur nests have been found in Jurassic Age deposits, though they are rarer than those of the Cretaceous. The evidence suggests that many sauropods laid their eggs in shallow depressions, scraped in the ground, covered them with vegetation or soil for warmth, and then, this is debated, either left them to incubate on their own or remained nearby to guard them. Imagine a sauropod nesting ground, a flat, open area, perhaps a riverbank, perhaps a sandy clearing, where a female has scraped a shallow trench in the warm soil with her powerful hind feet. Into this trench, she deposits a clutch of eggs, large, round, rough-surfaced, each one the size of a large grapefruit, perhaps bigger. The eggs are not arranged randomly. They are placed in a pattern, a rough circle, perhaps, or a line, with spaces between them that allow air to circulate and prevent overheating. When the clutch is complete, the female covers the eggs with a layer of soil and decaying vegetation, which generates its own heat through decomposition, maintaining the temperature within the nest at the warm, stable level that the developing embryos require. And then, did she stay? Did she guard the nest against the egg-eating predators, the small theropods, the mammals, the lizards, that would have found a sauropod egg an irresistible prize? Or did she walk away, leaving the eggs to the mercies of the world, trusting that the sheer number of eggs she had laid, perhaps dozens, perhaps hundreds over her lifetime, would ensure that at least a few survived, to hatch, to grow, to join the herds, to walk the ancient paths, to continue the species for another generation? We do not know. The nesting behavior of Jurassic sauropods is one of the garden's deepest silences, a chapter of the story that the fossil record has only barely begun to reveal. The passage of seasons marked by the moon and the slow turning of the Earth, the seasons of the Jurassic moved in rhythms that we can only partially reconstruct from the evidence available to us. The Jurassic climate was, on the whole, warmer and less seasonal than our own, but it was not constant. There were variations in rainfall, in temperature, in the length of day, in the patterns of cloud and wind and storm that shaped the lives of every living thing. Some regions experienced distinct wet and dry seasons, with dramatic differences in the availability of water and food between the green abundance of the rains and the brown austerity of the dry months. The growth rings in fossilized trees tell us something about these seasonal patterns. Some Jurassic trees show clear annual growth rings, bands of wide, fast growth alternating with narrow, slow growth, indicating a pronounced seasonal cycle. Others show rings that are less distinct, suggesting a more equable climate with less variation between seasons. The picture is complex, varying from place to place, and from time to time within the long span of the Jurassic itself. For the great herbivores, the changing seasons may have been the driving force behind migration. In the dry season, when rivers shrank and lakes dried, and the vegetation on the open plains turned brown and brittle, the sauropod herds may have moved to wetter areas, to the margins of permanent rivers, to the bases of mountains where rainfall was more reliable, to the coastal lowlands, where the proximity of the sea moderated the climate and maintained the green abundance that the giant bodies required. And in the wet season, When the rains returned and the rivers swelled and the plains erupted in a frenzy of new growth, the herds would have spread out again, fanning across the landscape, exploiting the temporary abundance, feeding and breeding and growing in the flush of resources that the rains provided. This cycle, wet and dry, growth and dormancy, abundance and scarcity, was the heartbeat of the Jurassic ecosystem. It was the rhythm that governed the movements of the herds, the breeding cycles of the predators, the germination of the plants, and the slow, steady, inexorable turning of the ecological wheel that kept the Garden of Giants alive and functioning for tens of millions of years. The waters of the Jurassic let us move now to the waters, to the rivers that wound through the green landscape like silver threads in a vast emerald tapestry, to the lakes that lay in low basins between the hills, their surfaces still and dark, reflecting the sky and the canopy and the silhouettes of creatures that came to their edges to drink. The rivers of the Jurassic were different from modern rivers. Many of them were broader and shallower, wide, braided channels that spread across floodplains in a network of shifting, sandy, gravel-bedded streams that merged and separated and merged again with each rain and each dry spell. The water was warm, significantly warmer than the rivers of temperate regions today, and it supported a community of organisms adapted to these conditions. It is said that the rivers were highways, corridors of movement through a forested landscape that was, in many places, nearly impenetrable. The sauropods may have followed rivers during their migrations, walking along the banks, crossing at shallow points, using the open corridors that the rivers created through the otherwise continuous forest as pathways from one feeding area to the next. The footprints that we find preserved in Jurassic rock are disproportionately found in river and lake sediments. Not because the dinosaurs spent most of their time near water, but because the fine-grained, rapidly deposited sediments of riverbanks and lakeshores were the ideal medium for preserving footprints. A footprint pressed into the mud of a forest floor might last for hours before being obliterated by new growth. A footprint pressed into the sticky clay of a riverbank and then covered by the next layer of sediment deposited by the next flood could last forever. The mammals in the shadows, in forgotten corners of the Jurassic forest, in the hollows of fallen trees, in burrows beneath the roots of cycads, in the dense undergrowth where the ferns grew thickest and the light was dimmest, other creatures lived, small, quiet, overlooked, but carrying within their tiny bodies the seeds of something that would, in another 120 million years, inherit the earth. The mammals, they were there. They had been there since the Triassic. Small, shrew-like creatures that scurried through the night, hunting insects, avoiding predators, living lives of such furtive, hidden, marginal existence that the fossil record preserves them only as scattered teeth and fragmentary jawbones. The dental remains of creatures that lived and died in the shadows of giants without ever coming to the attention of the giants themselves. The Jurassic mammals were diverse, more diverse than was once thought. Recent fossil discoveries have revealed an array of body forms and ecological strategies that suggest the mammals were not merely surviving in the Jurassic, but actively evolving, diversifying, exploring the niches available to them within the constraints imposed by the dinosaurian dominance of the larger body sizes. Docodonts, triconodonts, multituberculates, symmetrodonts. These unfamiliar names designate lineages of mammals that lived in the Jurassic and that experimented with different tooth shapes, different diets, different lifestyles. Some were insectivores, some were omnivores. At least one, Castoricorda, from the Middle Jurassic of China, appears to have been semi-aquatic, with a broad flat tail and webbed feet. A beaver-like body plan 160 million years before the first beaver. Another, Volaticotherium, had a membrane of skin stretched between its limbs, allowing it to glide from tree to tree like a modern flying squirrel. These creatures were small, none larger than a cat, most the size of mice or shrews. But they were there, watching, waiting, evolving in the dark, in the margins, in the forgotten corners where the giants did not look. And one day, after the fire and the ash and the long cold winter that would end the age of dinosaurs, they would emerge from those shadows and fill the empty world with forms and sizes and diversities that the Jurassic could never have imagined. But that is a story for another time, another chapter, another dream. The Archaeopteryx question. In the limestone quarries of Solnhofen, in what is now Bavaria, Germany, a unique geological circumstance preserved with extraordinary fidelity the life of a late Jurassic lagoon. An enclosed, shallow, stagnant body of water that periodically became anoxic, killing everything within it, and preserving their remains in the fine-grained limestone mud of the lagoon floor with a level of detail that borders on the miraculous. And among the thousands of fossils recovered from the Solnhofen limestone, the fish, the jellyfish, the horseshoe crabs, the pterosaurs, the small dinosaurs, the insects, one stands apart. One fossil that, when it was first described in 1861, shook the foundations of Victorian natural history and provided Charles Darwin with one of the most dramatic pieces of evidence for his then new theory of evolution by natural selection. Archaeopteryx, the ancient wing. The oldest known bird, or rather, the oldest known feathered dinosaur with the capacity for flight, a creature that sits precisely at the boundary between what we call dinosaur and what we call bird, a boundary that modern science has increasingly recognized as artificial, a human category imposed upon a continuum that nature itself does not divide. Archaeopteryx was small, roughly the size of a raven, with a wingspan of perhaps 20 inches. It had feathers, asymmetrical flight feathers on its wings and tail, arranged in the same pattern as those of modern birds, providing the aerodynamic surface necessary for powered or gliding flight. But it also had teeth, small, sharp teeth lining its jaws, like those of its theropod dinosaur relatives. It had clawed fingers on its wings, 3 of them free and functional, capable of gripping branches or prey. It had a long bony tail, not the short fused pygostyle of modern birds, but a long flexible dinosaurian tail lined with feathers on both sides, creating a structure that may have served as both a stabilizer in flight and a display device on the ground. Archaeopteryx was not the first bird. It was something older and more mysterious, a creature caught in the act of becoming, a fossil that preserves, in the fine-grained limestone of a Jurassic lagoon, the very moment of transition between 2 forms of life. A moment so fleeting, so improbable, so dependent on the accident of preservation in exactly the right conditions, at exactly the right time, that its survival into the present seems almost miraculous. It is said that only 12 specimens of Archaeopteryx have been found, along with a single isolated feather. 12 individuals out of a population that must have numbered in the thousands or tens of thousands. 12 snapshots of a creature that lived and breathed and flew, or glided or flapped or something in between, above the warm, shallow waters of a Jurassic lagoon, 150 million years before the first human eye would look upon its remains and recognize, in the impossibly delicate impression of feather on stone, the echo of a world in the process of inventing flight. The oceans beyond. Beyond the shores of the Jurassic continents, the seas teemed with life of their own. A parallel world of predators and prey, of vast and small, of ancient lineages and new experiments, all playing out in the warm, shallow, well-lit waters of the expanding Tethys and the nascent Atlantic and the ancient Panthalassa. Ichthyosaurs, the fish lizards, were among the most successful marine reptiles of the Jurassic, dolphin-shaped creatures that had adapted so completely to life in the water that they could no longer come ashore. They gave birth to live, young, tail first, in the open ocean. They hunted fish and squid with large, forward-facing eyes that granted them excellent binocular vision in the clear tropical waters. Some species grew to extraordinary sizes. Temnodontosaurus, an early Jurassic form, reached lengths of over 30 feet. Plesiosaurs, with their long necks, small heads, and 4 powerful flippers, were the other great group of Jurassic marine reptiles. They swam with a motion unlike anything in the modern ocean. Not the side-to-side undulation of a fish, not the up-and-down flexion of a whale, but a 4-flipper flying motion through the water, using their flippers as underwater wings to generate thrust and lift. Some plesiosaurs had extraordinarily long necks. In the late Jurassic genus Cretaceous, the neck contained over 30 vertebrae and made up nearly half the animal's total length. Marine crocodilians, giant filter-feeding fish. Ammonites spiraling through the water column and shells of breathtaking mathematical perfection. Belemnites, squid-like creatures whose bullet-shaped internal shells are among the most common Jurassic fossils. The seas were full, teeming, alive with a diversity that rivaled or exceeded the terrestrial ecosystems above. But the seas are a world apart, a world of salt and current and pressure, of darkness below and light above, of a kind of existence that the land-dwelling mind finds difficult to fully inhabit. Let us leave them for now, these oceanic mysteries, and return to the garden, to the forest, to the ferns and the mist, and the slow sacred footsteps of the giants moving through the green twilight of a world that has no idea it is being remembered. Ichthyosaurs, the fish lizards, were among the most successful marine reptiles of the Jurassic, dolphin-shaped creatures that had adapted so completely to life in the water that they could no longer come ashore. They gave birth to live, young, tail first, in the open ocean. They hunted fish and squid with large, forward-facing eyes that granted them excellent binocular vision in the clear tropical waters. Some species grew to extraordinary sizes. Temnodontosaurus, an early Jurassic form, reached lengths of over 30 feet. Plesiosaurs, with their long necks, small heads, and 4 powerful flippers, were the other great group of Jurassic marine reptiles. They swam with a motion unlike anything in the modern ocean. Not the side-to-side undulation of a fish, not the up-and-down flexion of a whale, but a 4-flipper flying motion through the water, using their flippers as underwater wings to generate thrust and lift. Some plesiosaurs had extraordinarily long necks. In the late Jurassic genus Cretaceous, the neck contained over 30 vertebrae and made up nearly half the animal's total length. Marine crocodilians, giant filter-feeding fish. Ammonites spiraling through the water column and shells of breathtaking mathematical perfection. Belemnites, squid-like creatures whose bullet-shaped internal shells are among the most common Jurassic fossils. The seas were full, teeming, alive with a diversity that rivaled or exceeded the terrestrial ecosystems above. But the seas are a world apart, a world of salt and current and pressure, of darkness below and light above, of a kind of existence that the land-dwelling mind finds difficult to fully inhabit. Let us leave them for now, these oceanic mysteries, and return to the garden, to the forest, to the ferns and the mist, and the slow sacred footsteps of the giants moving through the green twilight of a world that has no idea it is being remembered. Let us pause here, in the stillness, in the quiet between footsteps, and let us consider what it means, what it truly, deeply, honestly means to share a planet with creatures of this size. We are small. By the standards of the Jurassic, we are impossibly, laughably, incomprehensibly small. A human being standing beside a large brachiosaurus would reach approximately to the knee. The creature's foot, at rest on the ground, would be wider than our outstretched arms. Its body, seen from below, would block out the sky the way a building blocks out the sky when you stand at its base and look upward. With the same sense of vertigo, the same uneasy awareness of your own insignificance, the same instinctive recognition that you are in the presence of something that operates on a fundamentally different scale of existence. Scale matters. It changes everything. The physical laws that govern our experience of the world. The way gravity pulls at us, the way our muscles move our bones, the way heat leaves our bodies, the way our senses perceive the environment. All of these things change with scale. A creature the size of a mouse lives in a world dominated by surface tension and air resistance. A world in which a fall from any height is survivable and water behaves almost like glue. A creature the size of a brachiosaurus lived in a world dominated by gravity and momentum. A world in which a fall of even a few feet could be catastrophic, and the simple act of walking required the coordination of a muscular and skeletal system of extraordinary sophistication. The heartbeat changes. A mouse's heart beats 600 times a minute. A human heart beats 70 times a minute. An elephant's heart beats 30 times a minute. A sauropod's heart. And here we enter the realm of estimation, of educated guessing, of the careful extrapolation of known relationships to unknown organisms.
Or the subjective experience of seeing is entirely unknown. What did they hear? Probably low frequencies better than high ones. The deep rumbles and vibrations that traveled well through the dense, moist, sound-absorbing Jurassic forest. What did they feel? The warmth of the sun on plates of bone, the cool pressure of mud between toes, the vibration of other bodies moving through the ground nearby, the slow internal pulse of their own hearts, beating once every few seconds, a bass drum in the private symphony of their existence. We will never know. And perhaps that is the most sacred aspect of the Jurassic, the recognition that we stand at the edge of a great and permanent mystery. A mystery not of information, but of experience, of subjectivity, of the inner life of creatures so different from ourselves that no act of imagination, however dedicated, can fully bridge the gap. Or the subjective experience of seeing is entirely unknown. What did they hear? Probably low frequencies better than high ones. The deep rumbles and vibrations that traveled well through the dense, moist, sound-absorbing Jurassic forest. What did they feel? The warmth of the sun on plates of bone, the cool pressure of mud between toes, the vibration of other bodies moving through the ground nearby, the slow internal pulse of their own hearts, beating once every few seconds, a bass drum in the private symphony of their existence. We will never know. And perhaps that is the most sacred aspect of the Jurassic, the recognition that we stand at the edge of a great and permanent mystery. A mystery not of information, but of experience, of subjectivity, of the inner life of creatures so different from ourselves that no act of imagination, however dedicated, can fully bridge the gap. They were not a flash in the pan. They were not a brief experiment that the Earth tried and then abandoned. They were one of the most successful groups of animals the planet has ever produced, measured by the only metric that evolution ultimately respects: duration. And when they finally vanished, not in the Jurassic, but at the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, it was not because they failed. It was not because they were poorly designed or maladapted or somehow deficient. It was because the world changed, suddenly and catastrophically, in a way that no degree of adaptation could have anticipated. An asteroid 10 miles wide struck the Earth with the force of 100 million nuclear warheads, and the world that the sauropods had known for 90 million years was, in the space of a few hours, replaced by a world that was utterly, fundamentally, irreversibly different. But that ending is not part of our story tonight. Tonight we are in the Jurassic. The asteroid is still falling through the void, 100 million years from its appointment with the Earth. The sky is clear. The forest is green. The giants are walking. And the world, the sacred, breathing, and possibly magnificent world, has no idea that it will ever end. The sounds of evening. The afternoon is fading. The light that filters through the canopy shifts, subtly, slowly, from the greenish gold of midday to the warmer, deeper, amber green of approaching dusk. The shadows between the Araucaria trunks lengthen. The mist, which had thinned during the warmest hours, begins to thicken again as the air cools and the moisture that pervades everything condenses into visible form. The forest is entering its evening phase, the transition period between day and night that is, in many ecosystems, the most active time of all. Sounds change. The daytime hum of insects, a background noise so constant that it had become unnoticeable, begins to shift in pitch and quality as some species fall silent and others awaken. The low, buzzing drone of diurnal flies gives way to the higher, more musical chirping of evening crickets and katydids, sounds that, remarkably, have changed very little in 150 million years, so that a modern listener, transported to the Jurassic, would hear in the evening chorus something instantly familiar, instantly comforting, a thread of continuity connecting their own experience to this impossibly distant world. Frogs, or their relatives, the exact taxonomy of Jurassic amphibians is complex and debated, but the basic body plan and the basic behavior of small, vocal, water-associated amphibians was well established by the Jurassic. and it is entirely reasonable to imagine that the evening air near the rivers and the marshes was filled with the calls of small vocal creatures, producing sounds not unlike those of modern prefrogs and toads. A chorus of chirps and trills and croaks rising from the wet places, filling the dusk with a soundscape that was at once ancient and utterly alive. The pterosaurs settle into their roosts. The flying creatures of the day, the Rhamphorhynchus and its relatives, fold their membranous wings against their bodies and tuck their long-toothed heads under their arms, gripping branches with their clawed feet, settling into the postures of rest that would become, over the next 100 million years, the sleeping postures of the birds that would eventually replace them. The sounds change. The daytime hum of insects, a background noise so constant that it had become unnoticeable, begins to shift in pitch and quality as some species fall silent and others awaken. The low, buzzing drone of diurnal flies gives way to the higher, more musical chirping of evening crickets and katydids, sounds that, remarkably, have changed very little in 150 million years, so that a modern listener, transported to the Jurassic, would hear in the evening chorus something instantly familiar, instantly comforting, a thread of continuity connecting their own experience to this impossibly distant world. Frogs, or their relatives. The exact taxonomy of Jurassic amphibians is complex and debated, but the basic body plan and the basic behavior of small, vocal, water-associated amphibians was well established by the Jurassic, and it is entirely reasonable to imagine that the evening air near the rivers and the marshes was filled with the calls of small vocal creatures producing sounds not unlike those of modern frogs and toads. A chorus of chirps and trills and croaks rising from the wet places, filling the dusk with a soundscape that was at once ancient and utterly alive. The pterosaurs settle into their roosts. The flying creatures of the day, the Rhamphorhynchus and its relatives, fold their membranous wings against their bodies and tuck their long-toothed heads under their arms, gripping branches with their clawed feet, settling into the postures of rest that would become, over the next 100 million years, the sleeping postures of the birds that would eventually replace them. The ornithopods draw together. The small and medium-sized herbivores, for whom the approaching darkness brings increased vulnerability to predators, gather in their sleeping groups, clusters of individuals, perhaps family groups, perhaps mixed-age aggregations, pressing their bodies together for warmth and for the safety of numbers, their eyes scanning the darkening forest for the gleam of a predator's gaze. And the sauropods, the great wanderers. What did they do at night? Did they sleep? Did they rest? Did they simply continue? Walking, feeding, moving through the darkness with the same unhurried patience they displayed during the day? The answer, like so many answers about these creatures, is uncertain. Some believe that the largest sauropods may have been essentially continuous feeders, eating around the clock, their enormous bodies requiring such vast quantities of food that the luxury of extended rest was one they could not afford. Others believe they rested, standing perhaps, as modern elephants and horses often do, their massive legs locked in a weight-bearing posture that required minimal muscular effort, their heads drooping, their eyes closed, their great hearts beating slowly in the dark. The Jurassic night. Let the Jurassic night descend. Let the last amber light drain from the sky beyond the Araucaria canopy. Let the green afterglow linger for a moment at the horizon, that luminous emerald band that appears only at the boundary between sunset and darkness, when the sky holds its breath, and the world pauses between one state and the next. Let it glow there, that impossible green, for 1 minute, 2, 3, and then let it fade, slowly, gently, like a whisper that was never quite loud enough to become a word, dissolving into the deep blue-violet of twilight and then into the vast, star-scattered black of the Jurassic night. The air cools, but only slightly. The warmth of the Jurassic persists, even after dark, held by the moisture in the air, by the dense canopy overhead that traps the heat of the day like a blanket drawn over the sleeping earth, by the thermal mass of the soil and the stone and the water that have been absorbing solar energy all day, and now release it slowly, grudgingly, maintaining the temperature within a range that allows activity to continue, allows life to go on, allows the night to be not an interruption but a continuation of the day's great work. In the forest, the sounds shift fully now. The daytime chorus is gone, replaced entirely by the nighttime orchestra, a different ensemble, a different repertoire, but no less rich, no less complex, no less alive. The crickets and katydids are in full voice now, their songs rising from the undergrowth in overlapping waves of sound that create a continuous, pulsing backdrop against which all other nighttime sounds are heard. The frogs add their voices, deeper, more irregular, punctuating the insect chorus with croaks and trills that rise and fall and rise again in patterns that seem almost conversational, almost deliberate. Somewhere in the darkness, something moves through the undergrowth, something small, warm-blooded, furry, with large eyes adapted to the darkened ears that can hear the ultrasonic calls of the insects it hunts. A mammal, one of the multituberculates perhaps, or a docodont, a creature the size of a mouse, moving through the leaf litter with the careful stop and start motion of a small predator that knows it is both hunter and hunted, that every moment spent in the open is a moment of vulnerability, that the darkness is both shelter and threat. Above the canopy, the sky is extraordinary. The Milky Way, Our own galaxy, seen from within, stretches across the sky in a thick, luminous band of stars so dense that the eye cannot separate them, a river of light flowing from horizon to horizon in a slow cosmic arc. The constellations are different. The stars have moved in their orbits over 150 million years, rearranging themselves into patterns that no human eye has ever seen, patterns that had no names and no stories attached to them because there were no minds capable of naming or storing. The stars simply were ancient, hot, indifferent, burning in the void with the same nuclear fury they would maintain for billions of years, their light falling on a world that had no use for it except to see by, and that in the deep forests of the Jurassic could barely see by it at all. The moon rises. Larger than the moon we know, not dramatically larger, but perceptibly so, close enough to the Earth to appear perhaps 10 or 15% wider in the sky than it does today. Its light is stronger. Its tidal pull is greater. Its influence on the oceans, on the tides that wash the Jurassic coastlines, on the currents that move through the shallow seas, on the rhythms of reproduction and migration that are, in many modern organisms, still governed by the lunar cycle, is more pronounced. The moonlight falls on the fern prairie beyond the forest edge, transforming it. The green of the ferns becomes silver. The textures of the fronds catch and scatter the cold white light, creating a shimmering metallic surface that stretches to the horizon like a frozen sea. The shadows of the cycad clusters fall in long dark lines across the illuminated ground, sharp-edged and unambiguous in a way that the diffused, filtered light of the forest interior never allows. And in the distance, far away, at the very edge of hearing, the low vibration of giant footsteps continues, moving through the night, not resting, not stopping, following the ancient paths with the same unhurried certainty that has guided them through every day and every night for millions of years. The sound is faint now, barely perceptible, more felt than heard, a subtle shaking of the ground that might be mistaken for the wind, if there were any wind. But there is no wind tonight, only the stillness, and the footsteps, and the stars, the predator at twilight. Somewhere at the forest edge, an Allosaurus stands motionless. Its body is a shadow among shadows. Its dark, mottled skin, whatever color it may have been in life, it is now just darkness, just shape without color in the moonlit margins of the forest, blends with the trunks and the undergrowth so completely that it is invisible from more than a few yards away. Only its eyes betray its presence, 2 points of faint reflected light low and steady, fixed on the open ground beyond the tree line where the moonlight reveals. Every movement, every silhouette, every living thing that dares to cross the silver expanse between one patch of cover and the next. The Allosaurus breathes, slowly. Its great chest expands and contracts with a rhythm that matches the pace of the night itself. Unhurried, deliberate, each breath drawn through nostrils that detect, in the warm, humid air, a complexity of chemical information that the human nose cannot imagine. It smells the ferns, the soil, the distant water, the faint, acrid tang of pterosaur guano on the branches above, and something else, something warm and living and large, moving somewhere out there in the moonlit darkness, its scent carried on the still air like a whisper. The Allosaurus does not move. Not yet. Movement is for later. For the moment when the calculation is complete, when the distance is right, when the target is committed to its course and the ambush can begin. For now, there is only waiting, watching, the ancient, patient, predatory vigil that has kept the balance of the Jurassic for millions of years. And then, slowly, it turns, not toward the prey, away from it, back into the forest. The moment is not right. The distance is too great. The target is too alert. The predator dissolves back into the shadows, its footsteps silent on the deep moss, its body disappearing into the darkness as completely and as silently as if it had never been there at all. The threshold is guarded. The balance is maintained. The night continues. The dreams of Stegosaurus. On the open fern plain, far from the forest edge, a Stegosaurus rests, standing, its massive legs locked, its body swaying almost imperceptibly with each slow breath, its plates catching the moonlight along its spine in a row of silver-edged diamonds that glow faintly against the darker body beneath. Its head hangs low, close to the ground, close to the ferns whose scent is the last thing it registers before the deepening tide of sleep, carries it away from the Jurassic night, and into whatever inner landscape a Stegosaurus enters when consciousness fades and the body, at last, is still. What does a Stegosaurus dream? The question is absurd. It is unscientific. It is unanswerable by any method available to the rational mind, and yet it rises, unbidden, irresistible, whenever we sit long enough with the image of these creatures at rest. Do they dream? Do their brains, small, yes, but functional, capable of processing the sensory information necessary for survival in a complex and dangerous world, generate the internal imagery, the reorganization of memory, the narrative simulation that we call dreaming? The neuroscience of sleep in modern reptiles suggests that some form of sleep-related neural activity is present even in the most ancient vertebrate lineages. Whether this activity produces anything that resembles what we experience as dreams is unknown. But let us allow the question to remain. Let us not answer it. Let us simply hold it. Gently, in the quiet space between waking and sleep, and let it rest there, unresolved, like the Stegosaurus itself rests on the moonlit plain, its plates catching the cold light of stars that have been burning since before the Earth was formed, its great body motionless, except for the slow rhythmic rise and fall of breathing, its four tail spikes pointing skyward, like the four minarets of a mosque, or the towers of a castle, or the standing stones of a circle raised by hands that the Earth has not yet imagined, what the Earth remembers. There is a question that rises from the silence of the Jurassic night. A question that has no answer, or that has an answer we are not yet capable of hearing. Does the Earth remember? Not in the way we remember, with images and words and the complex neural machinery of human recollection, but in some other way, some deeper, more fundamental way, in the chemistry of the soil, in the structure of the rock, in the slow, cyclical, endlessly repeating patterns of growth and death and growth again that have characterized the living Earth for nearly 4 billion years. The footprints are there, pressed into stone. The bones are there, curled in darkness. The fern impressions, the leaf falls, the amber-trapped insects, the tracks and traces and chemical signatures of 150 million years of continuous, exuberant, impossibly complex life. All of it is there, preserved, held, kept, in the body of the Earth itself. Is this memory? Is the fossil record a form of remembering? The Earth's own way of keeping a journal, of recording the events of its long and eventful life, of noting, in the only language available to it, the language of mineral and crystal and compressed organic chemistry, the passage of every creature that has ever walked upon its surface, some believe so. Not literally, not with the intention of preserving information for future retrieval, but in the same way that a river remembers its floods, in the shape of its banks, in the layers of sediment it has deposited, in the pattern of its meanders that record, for those who can read them, the history of every high water and every low water and every ordinary, unremarkable day of flow between the extremes. The Earth remembers the Jurassic, not in words, not in images, but in stone, in the shape of bones held in the darkness for 150 million years, in the chemistry of coal and oil and natural gas, the compressed, transformed, concentrated remains of Jurassic forests and Jurassic organisms, stored in the rock like energy in a battery, waiting to be released, in the pattern of continental positions, the ongoing drift of land masses that began in the Jurassic and continues today, the Earth still rearranging the furniture of its surface in response to forces set in motion before the first flower bloomed. Beneath the silence of our world, the Jurassic continues. Not as a living ecosystem, that is gone, irrecoverably, permanently replaced by a succession of younger worlds, each building on the ruins of the last, but as a presence, a layer, a stratum in the deep geological column that the Earth has been building for 4.5 billion years. The Jurassic is there, beneath us, within us, in the carbon that cycles through our bodies, some of which may have been part of a Jurassic fern, a Jurassic tree, a Jurassic animal, before being released by decomposition and recycled through the vast, patient, endlessly turning machinery of the biosphere. We are not separate from the Jurassic. We are built from it, from the same atoms, the same molecules, the same chemical elements that were present in the bodies of the sauropods and the Allosaurus and the Stegosaurus and every other creature that lived and died in the Garden of Giants. The carbon in our bones may have been the carbon in their bones. The oxygen we breathe was produced, in part, by the photosynthesis of Jurassic plants. The water we drink has cycled through the atmosphere and the oceans and the rivers thousands of times since the Jurassic, carrying with it traces of everything it has touched, everything it has dissolved, everything it has washed from the surface of the stone. We are the Jurassic, rearranged. And the Jurassic is us, remembered in the only way the Earth knows how, in the shape of things, in the form of matter, in the slow, patient mineral poetry of a world that forgets nothing, even when it can no longer speak. The names we give them. The names we have given them are not their names. Diplodocus, Brachiosaurus, Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, Apatosaurus, Camarasaurus, Ceratosaurus, Torvosaurus, Archaeopteryx. These are Latin and Greek constructions. Descriptive labels assembled from classical roots by 19th and 20th century scientists working in European and American museums and universities, piecing together the fragmentary evidence of creatures they could never see, never touch, never hear, never smell, never watch as they move through a world that existed before the first human ancestor, descended from the first tree. These names are useful. They are necessary. They allow us to communicate about specific organisms with precision and clarity, but they are also, in some deep and important sense, inadequate. They are labels on a mystery, signposts pointing toward a reality that the signs themselves cannot contain. To say Brachiosaurus is to invoke a set of measurements, a collection of bones, a taxonomic position in a cladogram. It is not to invoke the creature itself, the warmth of its skin, the depth of its breath, the vibration of its footsteps through the soil, the particular quality of its attention as it raised its head above the canopy and looked out, for a brief and dizzying moment, across the green and endless world that was its home. The names the Earth gave these creatures are older, deeper, written not in language but in the shape of a footprint, the curve of a rib, the arc of a neck reaching toward leaves that have long since turned to dust, the patient arrangement of plates along a spine that will never again feel the warmth of the Jurassic sun. These are the names that matter, the names that the fossils speak, in the slow, quiet mineral vocabulary that only time can translate. And perhaps those names are still being spoken, softly, slowly, in the creak of ancient rock expanding in the afternoon heat, in the whisper of wind through the last surviving Araucaria forests of South America and Oceania, in the rustle of a ginkgo leaf falling from a branch in a city park, tracing the same fan-shaped arc that ginkgo leaves have traced since the Jurassic, unchanged, unforgotten, as if the tree itself were a living letter from an age that refuses, with the quiet stubbornness of something very old and very deep, to be completely erased. The ones who will come after. The Jurassic did not end, not truly, not in the way that a story ends with a final word, a closing page, a silence that means this is over. The Jurassic flowed. It transitioned. It merged, gradually and without clear boundary, into the Cretaceous, the next great act in the drama of the Mesozoic, the age that would bring flowers and tyrannosaurs and ceratopsians and the final, catastrophic ending that no one saw coming. The sauropods continued. Many lineages persisted into the Cretaceous, evolving into the Titanosaurs, the last, and, in many cases, the largest of the great sauropods, creatures that walked the Cretaceous continents with the same patient, earth-shaking majesty as their Jurassic ancestors, carrying within their bones the accumulated genetic wisdom of 90 million years of continuous evolution. The predators continued. The theropod lineages that had produced Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus and Torvosaurus evolved in new directions, toward the tyrannosaurs in the north, the ablosaurs in the south, the spinosaurs that haunted the rivers and coastlines of the Cretaceous world. Each new predator carried within it the echo of its Jurassic ancestry, the same basic body plan, the same fundamental design, refined and modified and elaborated, but never abandoned, never replaced, never fundamentally reimagined. The Stegosaurus itself did not survive into the late Cretaceous, but its relatives did, the ankylosaurs and the nodosaurs, the armored dinosaurs who took the principle of defensive bone and elaborated it to extraordinary extremes, producing creatures covered in plates and spikes and clubs of bone so elaborate and so formidable that they remain, even in fossil form, among the most visually striking animals the Earth has ever produced. And the birds, the descendants of the small feathered theropods that had begun, in the Jurassic, their tentative experiments with flight. They continued. They diversified. They survived the great extinction that ended the Cretaceous, the only dinosaurs to do so, and they radiated, in the aftermath, into the 10,000 species that fill the skies today. Every sparrow, every eagle, every penguin, and flamingo, and hummingbird, and owl. They are all dinosaurs. They are all the Jurassic's children. They carry in their hollow bones and their air sac lungs and their feathered bodies the legacy of an age that began 200 million years ago, and that, through them, has never truly ended. The closing of the garden. Let the Jurassic night hold you now. Let the great footsteps fade into the distance. Not gone, merely absorbed, taken into the earth the way the earth takes everything, with patience and without judgment and without the slightest trace of hurry. The Garden of Giants was never truly lost. It only moved deeper, beneath the surface, beneath the stone, beneath the layers of sediment and time that accumulate over us all like blankets on a sleeping child, one after another, heavier and heavier, until the weight itself becomes a kind of comfort, a kind of permanence, a kind of peace. The stars turn overhead, the same stars they have always been, not the same configurations. The constellations have shifted over 150 million years, rearranging themselves into new patterns for new eyes to name. The same fires, the same nuclear hearts, the same ancient light, traveling across the same void, arriving at the same planet, illuminating the same stone. Stone that was once mud. Mud that once held the footprint of a creature whose heartbeat, though long silenced, was once as real and as present and as undeniable as your own. Somewhere beneath you, beneath the floor, beneath the foundation, beneath the bedrock and the sediment and the deep, compressed, ancient layers of the Earth's long memory, the bones of the Jurassic rest. Not all of them. Most are gone, dissolved, recycled, returned to the chemical pool from which they came, but some remain, preserved in the stone, held in the darkness, waiting, though they have no consciousness with which to wait, no patience with which to endure, no hope with which to anticipate, for the moment when the slow processes of erosion and uplift and discovery bring them back to the light. And when that moment comes, when a hammer strikes a rock and the rock splits along an ancient seam and the eye of a human being falls upon the shape of a bone that has not seen the light since the Jurassic sun last touched it, what passes between them? What travels across the 150 million years that separate the creature's death from the moment of its discovery? Is it information? Is it meaning? Is it something closer to recognition? The deep, instinctive, unmistakable sense that what you are looking at was once alive, once warm, once part of a world that was as real and as full and as sacred as your own. Perhaps it is all of these things. Perhaps it is none of them. Perhaps what passes between the fossil and the finder is something that cannot be named in the language of the waking world. Something that belongs instead to the language of the dreaming world, The world you are entering now, the world where the distance between the present and the past dissolves and the Jurassic garden opens before you like a door that was always there, but that you could never see until you closed your eyes. The dream begins. In your sleep, perhaps, you walk there, among the ferns, beneath the mist, in the green twilight of a world that asked nothing of its inhabitants but their presence and received, in return, 150 million years of the most magnificent dreaming the earth has ever known. The Araucaria trunks rise around you like the pillars of a temple built by hands you will never see. The cycads bow their fronds. The ginkgo leaves scatter beneath your feet in patterns that feel deliberate, arranged, placed with the care of an artist who has been practicing the same design for 200 million years. The air is warm, thick, scented with moss and earth, and the faint, sweet, indefinable fragrance of something growing, always growing, in the spaces between one breath and the next. Somewhere ahead, through the mist, you feel it, the vibration, the deep, low, rhythmic tremor in the ground beneath your feet, the footsteps of the wanderers, growing closer, or perhaps growing more distant. In a dream, it is impossible to tell. The direction of sound, the passage of time, the difference between approaching and retreating, between beginning and ending, between the garden opening before you and the garden closing behind you. In a dream, all of these things are the same. All of these things are one. It does not matter. The garden is patient. It has waited for 150 million years. It has waited through the rise of flowers and the fall of the great ones, through the ice and the fire and the slow, painful, magnificent emergence of a species that would one day dig into the stone and find, pressed into the ancient darkness, the shape of a bone that once supported a body vast enough to shake the earth. The garden can wait a little longer. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the giants speak softly, not because they have grown faint, not because the passage of time has weakened them, not because the stone in which they sleep has dulled their message. They speak softly because the truest things have always been whispered, in the language of footprint and bone, in the silence between heartbeats, in the green and sacred darkness where the earth still remembers the weight of its most magnificent children. Let the silence hold you now. The ferns are soft beneath you. The mist is warm. The stars are the same stars they have always been, turning slowly overhead in patterns that have shifted but never stopped, in orbits that have changed but never ended. And the garden of giants, the garden where the sky grew green, is still here, beneath everything, within everything, woven into the fabric of the stone and the soil and the water and the air and the very atoms of your body, which were forged in the same stars that shone above the Jurassic and that will continue to shine long after every name and every memory and every dream has returned to the silence from which it came. The garden waits, patient, eternal, green. And perhaps the dream is beginning now. Perhaps it has already begun. Perhaps it never ended. Let the footsteps carry you. Let the mist enfold you. Let the ancient, sacred, impossible world receive you as it receives all things gently, slowly, without judgment, without urgency, without the slightest distinction between the living and the remembered, between the waking and the sleeping, between the breath you draw now and the breath that was drawn 150 million years ago by a creature whose heart was as large as your entire body and whose patience was as deep as the stone in which it sleeps. The garden is green, the sky is green, the silence is green, and you are here, and that is enough.